My God, get ready, because this story scared even me. It almost made me regret living in the Ozarks. This story is titled Box Fan and was sent to me by a viewer named simply Jeb. In it, he recalls a series of bizarre childhood rules and events at his grandparents' mountain home in the Ozarks, which ultimately led to the most traumatic moment in his life, the moment he realized monsters are real. This is the Unexplained Encounters podcast. I sleep with the fan on every single night, regardless of the reason, no matter the temperature. A box fan runs on the floor next to my bed at full speed. My wife thinks it's a white noise thing, something to help me sleep. She's gotten used to it over the years. She bought me one of those sound machines for Christmas a couple years back. It plays ocean waves and rain and all that stuff, and I thanked her, but I put it in the closet and kept on using the fan. She never asked why, but I'm sure she wondered. I think she could tell by my face that I didn't want to explain. I'm 34 years old. I've slept with a box fan on since I was 11, and I'll probably sleep with one on until the day I die. This is not a comfort thing. At least, not in the way you expect. I've never told anyone the full version of what I'm about to write down. Not even my wife. I've explained parts, yeah, like during a particularly bad night terror that had me standing in the hallway at 3 a.m. with my hands against the wall, like I was bracing for something to hit the house, and my wife found me there, asking what I'd been dreaming about. I didn't remember, I said, but that was a lie. Not too long ago, my grandfather passed away. He was 91 years old, lived a full life, and had been in a wheelchair for the last 12 years. A stroke had taken most of his left side. At the funeral, I was standing by the coffee and those little crustless sandwiches that only exist at church receptions when my cousin Parker walked up, and without any preamble or greeting, he leaned in and said, "You remember that night?" It wasn't a question, and I didn't treat it like one. I simply nodded, and we stood still for a while, until his wife called him over to deal with one of his kids, and that was it. We haven't talked about it since, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't shake something loose. So here it is. My grandfather owned 130 acres in the Ozarks, most of it backed up to Mark Twain National Forest land, in a part of southern Missouri where the nearest grocery store was a 40-minute drive and the nearest hospital was further than that. He had retired from the Missouri Pacific Railroad before I was born, and he spent his days doing whatever he wanted on that land, which mostly meant tinkering with small engines and sitting on his porch, growing tomatoes that he'd give away to anyone who stopped by. He was no farmer, though people sometimes assumed he was. He just had land, and he liked having it, and he kept it the way some men keep their guns, maintained and ready, though ready for what was never entirely clear to me as a child. The house was old, but solid. He and my grandmother had built it in 1961 with money he'd saved from the railroad, and it looked like what it was: a post-war rural home designed by people who valued function but had a limited interest in aesthetics. Single-story, partial basement, wood-paneled walls inside that had darkened over the decades to the color of strong tea. It smelled of coffee grounds and something chemically that I eventually identified as mothballs, which were stuffed into the closets. The porch wrapped around two sides and had a concrete floor that was always gritty underfoot. There were 2 rocking chairs out there that had worn smooth grooves into the concrete from decades of use. The property itself was mostly open yard around the house, maybe 2 acres of mowed grass, then the tree line on 3 sides. The 4th side was the gravel driveway, a quarter-mile of loose rock that popped under tires and announced every arrival long before you could see the vehicle. Beyond the driveway was just more trees. A barn sat about 200 yards from the house, listing to the south. It had stayed like that for as long as I'd been alive, as though it had decided 30 years ago how far it was willing to lean and had just committed to it. There was a creek that cut through the back portion of the property, where the woods thickened up, and in the summer it ran shallow enough to wade in, and deep enough in a few spots to sit down in up to your chest. Every summer, my parents sent me and my cousins out there for 2 or 3 weeks. Parker was 2 years older than me, fearless, in a stupid way, and I say that with the most love possible. Leia was my age, quiet, and loved reading books more than anything. Sometimes baby Derek would come too. He was Aunt Diane's youngest, maybe 4 or 5 years old during the years I'm talking about, but he was mostly just a background presence, trailing after the rest of us and crying when he couldn't keep up. During the day, that property was the best place on earth. I genuinely believed that. We had the run of the entire 100+ acres, and we used every inch of it. I remember catching crawdads in the creek with our bare hands, racing them on the flat rocks. We explored that barn hundreds of times, which was full of old equipment and barn swallows, and rusty junk that felt like pirate treasure to a 9-year-old. Grandpa even had an old 3-wheeler ATV. Yeah, if you didn't know, you could get a 3-wheeler back then. They were a bit more common than what you might see today, because they were soon considered way too dangerous. But back then he would let Parker drive it around the property while the rest of us clung to the back like it was a mechanical bull. Grandma kept a drawer in the kitchen full of candy too. Off-brand candy though, mostly. Most of it being butterscotch discs and peppermints. But occasionally, if you're lucky, there would be Snickers in there, hidden away specifically for the kids. Those really were the good days. I want to be clear about that. Those days were genuinely wonderful. It was the nights that were different. I've spent a long time trying to articulate exactly how the shift happened each evening, and the best I can describe it is that my grandfather had an internal clock that the rest of us could not see or hear, and around 5 or 6 o'clock every day, it would go off, and he would become a different person. Now hold on there, he didn't get mean, he didn't yell or become harsh, he just sort of went somewhere else inside himself. You could see it in the way he moved. He would straighten up from whatever he was doing, and his eyes would go to the sky like he was reading something written up there in a language meant just for him. His jaw would start to clench repeatedly, and then he would herd all the kids inside. The rule was that we had to be in the house before the first star appeared in the sky. Not before sunset, which would have been reasonable, but before the first star. In June in Missouri, the sun doesn't fully set until around 9 o'clock, but the first stars can show up in the east while the western sky is still pale. And Grandpa knew this. He watched for them every night with a patience that bordered on obsession. He would sit on the porch in his rocking chair and face east, just waiting. And the moment he saw that first pinpoint of light, wherever we were on the property, he wanted us inside. If we were down at the creek, he'd ring the iron bell mounted on the porch post, a real cast iron bell too, the kind you would see at old schoolhouses, and you could hear it across the entire property. That sound meant now. It did not mean start heading back, it didn't mean get an attitude or argue. It meant get your butt inside. Once inside, the house changed too. Grandpa would go room to room pulling down the blinds, and these were not typical blinds. Every window in that house had thick, opaque roller shades, the heavy kind that you might find in a dark room or a hospital room where a patient needed total darkness. They were mounted inside the window frames, and when you pulled them down, they sealed the glass almost completely. No light got in, and I suppose more importantly, no light got out. He pulled every single one of them down every single night, without exception, and we were not allowed to raise them or peek behind them until morning. He never explained why. It was simply the rule. And in that house, his rules had the weight of physics. You didn't question gravity, and you didn't question Grandpa. The doors were another thing. He had a deadbolt on every exterior door, which, for a rural house in the middle of nowhere, was already unusual. But the front door also had a chain lock and a sliding barrel bolt that he had installed himself. A heavy steel piece that seated into a bracket that he had lag-bolted directly onto the doorframe. Every night, I'd hear him making his rounds. The back door first, then the side door off the kitchen, then the front. Click, click, thunk, slide. The same order every time. The sounds of the house being sealed. And then there were the fans. Every bedroom had a box fan. The cheap kind you could grab at a hardware store for $12 or so, with plastic blades and a rattling motor, and 3 speed settings that were basically loud, louder, and broken sounding. In the room where the kids slept, a guest room with 2 twin beds and a folding cot, Grandpa would set the fan on a wooden chair between the beds and turn it on high before we went to bed. It roared. It pushed air around that didn't need pushing. The house did have central air conditioning that worked fine. The fan would dry out your eyes and your throat so that by morning you'd wake up feeling like you slept in a kiln. Parker hated it and complained about it every summer. Leia slept with a pillow over her face to block the wind. I would just pull the sheet up to my nose and breathed through the fabric, and I dealt with it. One summer, Parker asked Grandma directly why we had to sleep with the fans on. She said the house got stuffy at night and the fans helped circulate the air. Parker pointed out that the air conditioning was literally running, and Grandma gave him a look that was pleasant on the surface, but had something underneath it. Something that communicated very clearly that this line of questioning was finished. Then she said, "Your grandpa likes the fans on, so the fans stay on." And that they did. I understand now what the fans were for. I've understood this since I was 11. The fans were loud enough to cover the sounds from outside. Almost. That was their entire purpose. They were there so it was harder to hear what was walking around the house at night. I should tell you about the moon. There's a specific memory I keep coming back to, from a summer when I was 8 or maybe 9 years old. I was sitting on the porch with Grandpa after dinner while the sky was doing its long summer fade from orange to purple, and the moon was rising in the east, enormous and nearly full, a deep amber color. I said something about it, like, "Look at that moon," or maybe, "The moon's huge tonight." At first, I didn't think my grandpa was going to say anything. He rocked in his chair and looked at the moon, and he didn't look happy about it, like I was. Eventually, he said to me, as if I wasn't even there, "I hate that damned thing." I thought he was joking around. I even laughed, but it came out awkward and forced. He didn't laugh. Over the years, I started to notice a pattern without fully understanding it. Grandpa was worse on certain nights, and it took me a long time to connect those nights to the moon because I was a kid and I wasn't tracking lunar cycles for fun. But looking back, the pattern was unmistakable. On nights when the moon was full, he was tense and vigilant, more alert than usual and more watchful, up later than Grandma. On nights where there was no moon at all, when the sky was just a black field of stars with no light to speak of, he was something else entirely. He was afraid. I don't think I had a word for it when I was young, but that's what it was. On moonless nights, my grandfather was a man in the grip of a real, grinding fear. He would check the locks more than once. He'd sit in the living room long after everyone else went to bed. And come morning, he would look gray and hollowed out, like someone who had spent the night awake and watching for something that might or might not come. Some nights, despite that fan, I could hear things. The fan covered a lot, yes, but it didn't cover everything. And on certain nights, there were footsteps outside that house. They were slow footsteps pacing around, like someone circling something else, taking their time. It would move along one side of the house, pause, sometimes right outside our bedroom window. A pause long enough that I'd be holding my breath in bed, eyes open, seeing nothing because of those blackout blinds, thankfully, and then continue on around the next side. When I mentioned it at breakfast once, doing my best to sound casual about it, Grandma would smile and said that Grandpa had trouble sleeping and he liked to walk the property at night, said he was checking the animals in the barn to make sure nothing was getting into the feed. Parker, who was old enough by then to hear an explanation and measure it against what he actually believed, asked what exactly Grandpa was searching or checking for. Grandma changed the subject so smoothly, it was almost a magic trick, and before we knew it, we were talking about what we wanted for lunch. One night, I remember getting up to use the bathroom. I think I was 10 years old. The hallway was dark and the bathroom was on the far side of the living room, which meant I had to walk through the main part of the house to get there. As I passed through the living room, I stopped. Grandpa was in his recliner, The TV was off. Every light in the house was off. He was sitting perfectly upright with his deer rifle laid across his thighs, and his eyes were open, and he was staring at the front door. He didn't look at me. He didn't move. He did not acknowledge me in any way. He sat there like a man who had been sitting there for hours, and intended to sit there for hours more, watching that door with deadly focus, as if he expected it, or prayed that it wouldn't open. I went back to bed, and I listened to the fan and the footsteps outside, and I did not go back to sleep for a long time. The last thing I need to mention before I get to the rest of this is the basement. During the day, the basement was fair game. It was an unfinished space with concrete floor, cinder block walls, exposed ceiling joints, and it held the washer and dryer, a bunch of storage shelves, and a workbench Grandpa used for small projects. It had these narrow slit windows that sit at ground level from the outside, wider than they are tall, hinged at the top so they could swing inward for ventilation. During the day, Grandpa sometimes propped them up to air out the place. After dark, the basement, though, was off limits, and the way Grandpa communicated this was different from his other rules. Those other rules, the blinds, the fans, the inside before stars rule, those were enforced through routine. He just did them and you fell in line because that's how things worked. The basement rule was the only one he ever stated out loud, directly, looking right at us. He said, "You do not go in that basement after the sun goes down." And his face when he said it was not the face of a man setting a household boundary, but rather someone telling you not to put your hand into a running engine. He was not making a rule as much as he was describing a very real danger. For years, that's what summers were. The days were creek water and crawdads and the smell of cut grass and Grandma's fantastic cooking. But the nights were blackout blinds, locked doors, the drone of a box fan drowning out whatever moved in the dark outside. I accepted all of this. I was a kid. It was part of my world. Like Santa Claus, you accepted these kinds of things without analysis. This was Grandpa's house, and these were Grandpa's rules, and the world at Grandpa's house simply worked differently than it did at home. So I never really questioned it, and I followed every rule to the letter, right up until the summer I turned 11. That was the summer Grandpa had his stroke, when the rules came apart, and I finally truly learned what all of it had been for. Now, I know I said the last thing I would mention before the real story would be the basement thing, but there is one more thing I need to tell you before I get to what happened the summer I was 11. This is the story my grandfather told me on the porch. I was around 9 or 10. It was a full moon night. I remember that because the moon was the reason I was outside at all. I couldn't sleep despite the fan, or maybe because of it. My throat felt like sandpaper and I needed some water. When I padded out to the kitchen to get some, I could see through the gap at the bottom of the living room blinds. The porch was lit up silver white, bright enough to read by, and the front door was open to the screen. Obviously, this was all very bizarre. Grandpa never left doors open at night, never had the blinds in a way we could peek through them. But there he was on the other side of the screen door, sitting in his rocker with the rifle across his knees, staring out at the yard and the tree line beyond it in all that cold moonlight. I pushed open the screen door and he looked at me. I expected him to tell me to go back to bed right away, but he didn't do that. He looked very tired. In fact, I'd never seen him so tired. And I want to say it wasn't like a sleepy kind of tired either. The man looked absolutely worn through, a tiredness that went beyond muscles. He studied me for a second, then he tipped his head toward the other rocking chair. I sat down in it with my feet dangling, because I was too short to reach the concrete. We sat there for a while without talking. The moon was so bright it threw hard shadows across the yard, and the tree line at the edge of the mowed grass looked like a wall someone had built out of pure blackness, but then backlit it from the inside with pale gray where the moonlight caught the upper canopy. It was beautiful enough to take your breath away. Every few seconds a bat would cut through the light above the yard, there and gone so quick it was like a glitch in your vision. Then Grandpa began to talk. He didn't look at me when he did, and he didn't raise his voice above a low murmur. It really looked like he was talking to himself rather than to me. He told me a story, and I'm going to relay it here the way I can remember it, which means it might have gaps or rough edges, because I was a child then when I heard it, and he was not a man who knew how to tell a story in any organized fashion. He was blunt and sparse, with a lot left out that he either assumed you'd fill in or preferred you didn't. So here goes. When my grandfather was young, 20 or 21, he said, something had started getting into the livestock on the properties around his family's land. His father, my great-grandfather, raised cattle, and a few of the neighboring families had cattle or hogs or both. Over the span of maybe a month, animals started to turn up dead in the fields and pens, and from the way Grandpa described it, dead was putting it generously. He said the animals were taken apart. He used that phrase specifically. Taken apart. Like a mechanic taking apart an engine. Pieces here, pieces there. Organs separated from the body and moved to places they shouldn't be. He said one of the neighbor's heifers was found with its ribcage opened up and emptied out, with the contents arranged in the grass beside it, in what he called a kind of order, though he wouldn't say what that meant, and I wasn't asking. I remember thinking, how is he telling a kid my age all of this? But he kept going. The initial assumption was dogs. Feral dogs were a real problem in that part of the Ozarks. Packs of them could form up out of strays and dumped pets. They could bring down a calf if they were hungry and numerous enough. But the men who looked at the remains said it wasn't dogs, and it wasn't coyotes either. Because dogs and coyotes are messy, frantic killers that tear into whatever they can reach and leave a scattered wreck. Whatever was doing this, it was doing it with a kind of deliberateness, and that did not match any predator that they knew of. Grandpa said his father came back from examining one of the kills and sat at the kitchen table, completely silent. When Grandpa's mother asked him what was wrong, he simply said, "Something's pulling them apart with its hands." Now, nobody called the game warden or the sheriff. This was the rural Ozarks in the early 1950s. These men solved their own problems. My great-grandfather organized a hunt. He put the word out to the surrounding families. Grandpa's Uncle Earl, two men from the next property over whose names I've long forgotten, or maybe I never knew, and a cousin of some kind, who I think was only there mostly because he owned dogs that had been used for tracking boar. In total, there were 5, maybe 6 men, including my grandfather, who was the youngest at the time, and was allowed to come because he owned a rifle too, and knew how to use it, and because his father was not the kind of man you argued with successfully. They went out on a night when the livestock killings had been at their worst. Grandpa said they waited for the moon to be up, so they'd have light. They brought rifles and lanterns and the tracking dogs, 2 of them, big bony hounds with scarred up ears, and they went into the trees behind my great-grandfather's property at around 10 o'clock at night. Grandpa told me about this part of the hunt in pieces, and some of what he said I've had to reconstruct from what I remember, and what makes sense in context. Because, like I said, he was not a natural storyteller, and I was a kid, sitting in the dark, trying to follow an old man's fragmented account of something that happened 40 years before I was born. The dogs lasted about an hour. They went in eager, excited hounds with a scent to follow, heads down and pulling against their leads. But then they stopped, both of them, at nearly the same time. They froze where they stood and began shaking. Grandpa said one of them urinated on itself. They refused to move forward, and they refused to stay quiet. They started to make a sound that he described as a continuous whine, high and thin. Not a game call, but something from when it's gone beyond fear into a place where its brain had stopped working properly. One of the dogs ripped free of its lead and bolted off. They heard it crashing through the underbrush for about 30 seconds, and then the sound faded and they never found that dog. The remaining hound pressed itself against its owner's legs and had to be dragged along for the rest of the night, like a piece of furniture. So after the dogs became useless, the men kept going on their own. They were deep in the timber by this point, in that old-growth Ozark woodland, where the canopy closes overhead and the moonlight comes through in patches. Everything between those patches is ink dark, Grandpa said they could hear something moving in the trees around them. He was specific about this part. He said it wasn't moving through the underbrush like a deer or a boar would, pushing through branches at ground level. It was moving above them, in the canopy. He said they could hear branches creaking and snapping up high, the sound of something heavy transferring its weight from limb to limb, and it was fast, much faster than walking pace. He said it circled them for a while, up there in the dark above the lantern light, and the sound of it was like a man running on all fours across treetops, which is an image I've never been able to get out of my head, even though I heard this sitting on a porch 20-some years ago. They kept moving because they were men who had committed to doing something, and because turning back now would have meant walking through the same stretch of forest they had just come through, and whatever was pacing them in the canopy would have still been there. Grandpa said they walked for maybe another half hour, with the sound above them coming and going, sometimes close enough that debris would fall on them, small twigs and bark and pieces of leaf, other times far enough away that they nearly convinced themselves it had gone. The remaining dog had given up walking entirely and was being carried by its owner. Then, the thing came down out of the trees. Grandpa didn't describe this like a dramatic moment. He said it matter-of-factly, like someone saying it started to rain. The crashing above them stopped, and there was a heavy sound about 40 yards ahead of them, like something landing on the ground from a great height. Then, silence. It was Uncle Earl who saw it first. Earl was at the front of the group, a few paces ahead of the others, carrying a lantern in one hand and his rifle in the other. He stopped walking and said very low without turning around, "It's standing up." Grandpa raised his lantern. At the far edge of the light, about 30 yards out where the glow gave way to solid dark, he could see a shape between two trees. He said it was tall, taller than any of them, and Earl was over 6 feet. It was standing on 2 legs and it was perfectly still. The lantern light was too weak at that distance to give him anything more than an outline, but he said the outline was enough. He said it looked like someone had taken the general idea of a person and built it after stretching the measurements. He said the head set forward on the neck, reminding him more of a vulture, with a long-looking snout or perhaps a nose, and its shoulders were enormous, far too wide for the head they supported. The arms hung past where arms should stop. Then it dropped forward onto all fours, and it was gone. The sound of its movement exploded back into the canopy above them, crashing through the branches heading north, fast and getting farther away. The men stood there in a circle of lantern light, with their rifles up, and nobody said anything for what Grandpa estimated was about 2 full minutes. They should have gone home. They all knew that. But they didn't, because Uncle Earl said the thing was heading toward the Dawson property, where cattle had been killed the week prior. And because these were Ozark men in the 1950s, and going home would have been something they'd have to live with for a long time, they followed. The timber got worse as they went north. The terrain broke up into ridges and draws and rocky shelves where the footing was bad even in daylight, and the men started to spread out because you couldn't walk 6 abreast through that kind of country. They kept in contact by calling to each other. Grandpa said his father would shout, and the others would shout back, a kind of roll call every few minutes to make sure nobody had fallen or gotten turned around. The thing in the canopy had gone quiet. Or at least, they couldn't hear it over the sound of their own movement across the rough ground. Suddenly, there was a gunshot, a single sharp crack that bounced off the ridge walls and came from the east, from Uncle Earl's direction, because Earl had drifted the furthest from the group. Grandpa said everyone stopped where they were, and in the silence after the shot, they heard Earl screaming. He was far enough away that the sound was thin and echoing and hard to locate precisely. But it was unmistakably a man screaming in a register that Grandpa said he'd never heard from a grown person before, and never heard again after. Then there was a second shot, which cut off the screaming. Then nothing. Just the trees in the dark, and all of them standing in it. For some time, Grandpa went quiet after he told me that part. He rocked in his chair and looked at the moon, and his hands were still on the rifle across his lap. I could see that even decades later, the memory of that silence after the second shot was costing him something to sit with. I waited because even at 9 or 10, I understood that you don't interrupt a man when he's in a place like that. When he started again, his voice was flatter. He said they'd found Earl's rifle at the bottom of a draw, wedged between two rocks. It had been fired twice, both rounds spent. There was blood on the rocks and on the ground, a lot of it, and there were drag marks leading down into a ravine so choked with brush and fallen timber that they couldn't push through it in the dark. They stood at the edge of that ravine, calling Earl's name until the sky started to lighten up in the east. My grandfather didn't tell me what they found when they went back in daylight. He said, "They told his wife it was an animal attack." I noticed that phrasing even then, young as I was. They told her. He didn't say it was an animal attack. He told me what they told her it was, and the gap between those two things was wide enough to fall into. The official family story, the one I'd heard at Thanksgiving tables and funerals my whole life, without knowing it had any connection to my grandfather's property, was that Earl had died in a hunting accident, had shot himself, and by the time the search party had reached him, animals had gotten to the remains. A tragedy, but the kind of tragedy that happened in the rural Ozarks. People accepted it, because it was the kind of thing that could be accepted. Grandpa sat with me for a while longer after he finished. The moon had moved since he'd started talking, and the shadows in the yard had shifted with it. The tree line looked different than before. Not to say it was menacing, exactly, but more aware. Like when you walk in a room and you didn't know that someone was in there and they never announce themselves. You simply see them suddenly. Eventually, he looked at me, and his eyes were clear and direct. He said, "There's something in those woods that doesn't have a name, and it's smarter than you want it to be. That's why we have the rules. You understand?" I nodded. "The worst nights are the new moons," he said. "On a full moon, you can see it coming. On a new moon, it can see you, and you can't see a thing." He told me to go back to bed then, and I went. I pulled the sheet up to my nose, and I listened to the box fan roar. But I did not go back to sleep that night. In the morning, I looked out the window at the tree line in the early sunlight. It was just trees, the very same trees I had played under the day before, but now they meant something completely different. After that night on the porch, I never doubted or wondered about the rules again. I would pull the blinds down myself, turn the fan on before anyone told me to, and I would be the first inside before the first star even showed, every single time without being asked. The footsteps outside some nights that Grandma said were Grandpa checking on the animals. I knew what those were now. My grandfather was not inspecting the barn. Grandpa wasn't even outside. Something in those woods had taken my grandfather's uncle apart in a ravine 40 years ago, and it was still here. I understood the rules. I followed the rules. And those rules kept us safe every summer of my childhood, until the summer my grandfather collapsed in his kitchen with a mug of coffee shattering on the linoleum and the left side of his body going slack. Suddenly, the only person who truly knew what the rules were for was unconscious and driven to a hospital. Grandpa's stroke happened one morning in the middle of our second week during that stay. He was standing at the counter pouring coffee from the percolator, the same thing he did every morning at the same time, and his left hand simply opened on its own and let the mug fall. It hit the floor, breaking into 3 pieces, and coffee went everywhere. Grandpa looked down at it, then looked at Grandma, and said, "Joyce, there's something wrong with my arm." Then he sat down in a kitchen chair heavily, like someone had increased the gravity in the room, and the left side of his face slid downward and stayed there. Grandma called 911, She called Aunt Diane too, who lived 4 hours away in the suburbs outside St. Louis. Then she did what she could, which was to hold Grandpa's right hand and talk to him in a steady voice while the three of us stood in the kitchen doorway, watching, not knowing what to do with ourselves. I remember that the ambulance took a long time to get there. That's how far out we were from anything. They loaded Grandpa onto a stretcher. He looked so small and frail. I remember thinking that my grandpa might die, and I was scared. This man, who had been the largest presence in every room he ever entered, now looked like a gray-faced old man with only one working hand. Grandma couldn't go with him, not until Aunt Diane came, and once Aunt Diane showed up, Grandma left in a hurry. I remember just after she left, looking at the blinds on the windows, thinking that no one in this house would know to pull them down, and why. Aunt Diane and her husband Cal arrived around 3 in the afternoon, hugging Grandma and wishing her and Grandpa the best as she left. Aunt Diane was Grandpa's youngest daughter, a very sweet woman with a loud laugh who worked as an office manager somewhere. She drove a minivan and had probably not spent a full night in this house in 15 years. Uncle Cal was fine, a big, soft-spoken guy who sold insurance and was decent with kids. He gave lots of those cheesy kid compliments and high fives, like, "Good job, sport," that kind of thing. They were the kind of adults you'd want around during a family emergency, for sure. Warm and capable. Aunt Diane spent most of the evening on the phone with the hospital and with other relatives, leading a sort of crisis management with the family. Uncle Cal ordered pizza from the one place that would actually deliver that far out, which took over an hour. He even let us eat it in the living room in front of the TV, which Grandma never allowed. That first evening I kept waiting for someone to start the routine, hoping someone was watching the sky and would call us inside if we were outside, or go room to room with the blinds, setting up fans, locking doors. But nobody did. The sun went down and the windows stayed uncovered, and the doors stayed latched with their regular locks, not with the deadbolts. No chain, no barrel bolt, nothing. The fans stayed in the closet where Grandma stored them during the day. That house felt utterly naked, like a body without skin. Everything that was supposed to be protected was now open and exposed to whatever was out there. I almost said something. I stood in the hallway and rehearsed it in my head. Something about how Grandpa liked the blinds down and the fans on. Something casual that wouldn't require me to explain why. But I couldn't figure out how to say it without sounding strange. I was 11 years old, but the weight of adult attention during a crisis was paralyzing, so I didn't say anything. I went to bed in the guest room with Parker and Leia. The window was uncovered, and the fan was off. I lay there in the most awkward silence, so enormous and wrong, I could hear my own heartbeat. I slept eventually. The following day was almost normal. Uncle Cal took us outside. We rode the three-wheeler and threw rocks in the creek, and Aunt Diane drove to the hospital, coming back in the late afternoon with a cautiously optimistic report. Grandpa was stable, responsive, but they were keeping him for observation and tests. There was also talk of moving him to a larger facility in Springfield. She looked exhausted. Uncle Cal made spaghetti for dinner. It was watery and undersalted, but we all ate it. Nobody had the energy to care about food quality at the time. That evening, Parker pulled me and Leia aside in the hallway. I could tell he was being very sneaky about something. "They don't care what we do," he said, meaning Aunt Diane and Uncle Cal, who were back on the phone in the master bedroom with the door mostly shut. "We should stay outside tonight, after dark. We're never going to get that chance again." Leia looked at me. I could tell she wanted me to say no so she wouldn't have to. And I nearly did. But Parker was 13 and I was 11. At that age, that's a big gap. And some part of me, the side that was tired of being so afraid every summer, tired of the fans and the blinds and the locked-down feeling of Grandpa's nighttime house, that side wanted to know what the property was like after dark. I'd spent years sealed inside while the world outside continued without me, and I wanted to see it. So I said okay, and Leia said okay because I had, and Parker grinned. We went out the back door at around 8:30, with the sky still holding on to the last orange glow in the west, but the east had already gone to deep blue. The very first thing that struck me was how different the property sounded at night. The creek, which was a pleasant background murmur during the day, was loud, more present, so to speak, in the dark, even aggressive sounding. The bugs were deafening, a whole wall of sound from every direction, cicadas and crickets and tree frogs layering over each other in a pulsing roar that seemed to breathe. And underneath all that was the woods. The tree line was about 60 yards from where we stood at the back of the house, and in the dying light, it looked solid, a dark mass without depth or detail. We had flashlights, 2 of them, from the kitchen junk drawer, but both were so weak that they barely reached 20 feet. Parker swept his across the yard like a searchlight. It revealed a narrow cone of grass and bugs, but nothing more. Beyond that cone was just more dark. He started to walk toward the tree line. Leia and I followed, too scared to be away from our oldest member. For about 20 minutes, it was what Parker had promised, an adventure. We walked along the edge of the trees without going in, shining our flashlights into the first few yards of timber, seeing trunks and underbrush. Occasionally, we found a pair of tiny reflective eyes, probably belonging to some small or low-to-the-ground raccoon or possum. Parker kept up a running commentary during this, about how this wasn't even scary, and that Grandpa's rules were just an old man being paranoid. I let him say those things because I simply didn't know what to say, and I liked the lack of silence. Suddenly, Leia stopped. She was slightly behind me and to my left. When I turned around, she was standing very still with her flashlight pointed at the tree line, about 40 yards south of where we were. Her flashlight was weak, and it barely reached the trees at that distance. But at the very edge of its throw, where the light gave up and the dark took over again, there was a shape between 2 trunks that I could not make sense of. It was taller than any of us by a significant margin. It was also narrow, standing on 2 legs, but it was completely motionless. The flashlight was much too dim to give any texture or color, so it remained a silhouette, a vertical interruption in the pattern of the trees behind it, and it was facing us. "Something standing there," Leia said. Her voice was perfectly calm. Parker swung his flashlight toward it. For half a second, both beams hit roughly the same area, and in that combined light, I saw, or I thought I saw, the shape shift, a sudden movement, quickly, like something rearranging its posture. Leia's light flickered then. These were cheap, battery-powered flashlights. In that half-second of reduced light, the shape was gone. Just trees. Just ordinary dark between tree trunks. Parker said it was a deer. He said it with enough conviction that I knew he didn't believe it. And I think Leia knew too, because she was already walking toward the house, and she was walking fast. We followed her, and how we kept from actually full-on running, I have no idea. Perhaps we were too scared to run, but we walked at a pace that was as close to running as you could get. And when we made it to the back door and went inside, shutting it behind us, Parker locked the knob lock and then stood there looking at the deadbolt above it. He looks at us, then half laughs, saying, "It'll be fine." So we left it unlocked, and we didn't say anything else about it. We stood in the kitchen, breathing harder than the walk justified, and Parker then said, "That was fun." But Leia and I stayed quiet. He then said, "We should sleep down in the basement tonight." I felt my stomach drop when he said it. The basement was the other room, the one Grandpa had spoken out loud with his eyes locked on mine, and hearing Parker propose breaking it felt like hearing someone suggest swimming in a river during a storm. But Parker was already talking about it like it was decided. He'd seen the old Nintendo down there, he said, when Aunt Diane had gone down to do laundry earlier. And there were games, and probably other stuff. And the basement was cool, and it would be like a fort. And he reiterated, when would we get another chance? I looked at Leia. She had her arms crossed over her chest, and she was staring at the floor. We were both wondering the same thing, I think. How much resistance was worth the cost of Parker's ridicule? She must have arrived at the same answer I did. because she shrugged one shoulder and said, "Whatever." And Parker took that as unanimous consent and started gathering supplies. We brought sleeping bags and pillows from the guest room. Parker grabbed a bag of chips and 3 cans of Coke from the fridge. Leia brought a book, which was optimistic. We trooped down the wooden stairs into the basement, and Parker pulled the chain on the single bare bulb at the bottom. The room came to life in harsh yellowish light. Everything else was concrete and shadow. Honestly, for a few hours though, it was great. Parker found the NES under the workbench, still connected to a small TV that must have been old when Reagan was president, and after 20 minutes of blowing into cartridges and fiddling with the AV cables, he got it to work. We played Excite Bike, then Duck Hunt without the light gun, just using the controller, which didn't work perfectly, but we didn't mind. Leia found a stack of board games on a shelf, Sorry and Clue and something called Aggravation that none of us had ever heard of. We played Clue on the concrete floor with the chips and soda spread around us, like we were having a picnic. Parker discovered a cabinet near the water heater that contained, among other things, a collection of candy so old that some of it was in packaging I didn't recognize. We tried a few pieces. They tasted like sweetened chalk. We ate them anyway, because adventure was the whole point. Really, it was the most fun I'd had at that house in years, maybe ever. We were loud and stupid and free, and Aunt Diane and Uncle Cal never came down to check on us. For those few hours, the basement was just a basement, and the rules we were used to, they were just the eccentricities of an old man, who was currently in a hospital bed 40 minutes away, with tubes in his arm. We fell asleep in stages. Leia went first. She had set up her sleeping bag near the base of the stairs, and was out cold by midnight. Parker lasted a little longer on the sagging couch against the far wall, talking to me about a girl from his school, while his sentences got slower and more fragmented, until they stopped entirely, and his breathing evened out. I lay in my sleeping bag in the middle of the floor. I was between the two of them, looking up at the ceiling joists and the cobwebs, listening to the silence. No fan, just silence. I hadn't really thought about that part until that very moment. I'd been distracted by the games and the food and the novelty of it all. But lying there in the dark after Parker killed the light, the silence of that basement was absolute. No fan roar to fill the space, and no white noise to blur the edges of whatever sounds the night might be making. There was, though, the faint ticking of the water heater, and the even fainter hum of the electrical panel on the wall. But beyond that, nothing. I listened to my cousin's breathing. It was so dark and so quiet. It felt like I was deep, deep underwater. Eventually, and I don't know when, I fell asleep. But when I woke up, I was very cold. Genuinely cold. A damp chill had gotten through the sleeping bag and into my skin. It made no sense because it was July in Missouri, and the basement had been stuffy and warm when we'd come down. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around myself. That's when I felt the draft. Moving air coming from somewhere to my left, carrying a smell that did not belong in that basement. The green, wet smell of outside, of grass and dirt and night air, and underneath it was something else. A warm and sour and biological smell. It reminded me of a dog's breath, but heavier and denser, more concentrated. One of the slit windows was open. I couldn't see it. I couldn't see it. The dark in that basement was the most complete dark I'd ever experienced, where open and closed eyes were the same thing. But I could feel the outside air coming through it. I could feel that the air was wrong, that it carried the heat and smell of something that was not the night. And every hair on my body stood up at once. I heard it before I could even make sense of it. Breathing. Low and wet, raspy on the exhale. A large animal trying to keep quiet. Something was in the room with us. Something was inside the basement. And it was breathing. It was close. I stopped moving, and I stopped breathing. every muscle in my body locked into a rigid, frozen state that I did not choose and could not have overridden if I'd tried. My higher brain, the part that reasons and plans and makes decisions, had been disconnected from the controls entirely, and what was running me now was something much older, much simpler. Something that said to me, you must not move, you must not breathe, you must no longer exist. The breathing shifted. It moved through the room, slowly, with a carefulness that was worse than speed, because speed would mean a panicked animal, and this was not panicked. It was methodical. And beneath that breathing, accompanying it, I heard the footsteps, a light, clicking, tapping cadence on the concrete floor. The sound of something with claws, walking on a hard surface, and the rhythm. It didn't match anything that walks on two legs, but it didn't quite match anything that walks on four. The sound of it moving across the concrete floor in the perfect dark was the most alien and dislocating thing I've ever heard. It moved past me, close enough that I could feel warmth coming off of it, the radiant body heat of something large and very alive, and I caught a wave of that smell, that sour, biological, overly wet dog smell. But up close, it was sharper, and there was more underneath it, something that reminded me of blood. It passed within what had to be 2 or 3 feet of my sleeping bag, and I lay there with my eyes wide open in the dark, and I saw absolutely nothing. I felt it go by me, like a weather system. Then it stopped, near the couch where Parker had been sleeping. I heard the breathing change then, faster, shorter, with a sniffing quality, like it was sampling the air around him. Then it moved again, toward the stairs, toward Leia. It stopped. The breathing was maybe 4 feet from my head, 4 feet from Leia's sleeping bag at the base of the stairs. I could hear her slow, unconscious breathing, and the thing's breathing layered over it, and for a span of time that I cannot accurately estimate. Was it 5 seconds, 30, a full minute? Those were the only sounds in the world. Then the thing made a sound, a low and soft sound from deep in its chest, barely louder than the breathing. It wasn't a growl, and it wasn't a whine. It sat somewhere between the two, carrying an emotion I should not have been able to read, but I could. It was interested. Whatever was standing over my cousin in the dark was curious about her. Leia shifted in her sleeping bag, a small unconscious movement, the kind of half-roll that sleeping people do, and she made a sound, a murmur, maybe a fragment of a dream, nothing coherent. But then her eyes opened. No, I couldn't see it. I knew because she spoke then. Her voice was muzzy and confused and half asleep, and I heard her say, "Is that a dog? Who let a—" The rest of her sentence was replaced by a sound that I will hear for the rest of my life. A sudden detonation of movement, claws scrabbling on concrete, a heavy, wet impact of a body hitting the sleeping bag, and the sound of the bag being seized and wrenched sideways across the floor so quickly that Leia's confused question turned into a scream that did not sound like language or even a human voice anymore. Just a raw and primal shriek of an animal in terror. It bounced off the concrete walls, filling the basement from floor to ceiling. I heard the sleeping bag dragging, fast, impossibly fast, scraping across the concrete toward the far wall where the open window was. Trust me, I would soon know where that open window was exactly. I could hear Leia thrashing about inside the sleeping bag. The thing had hold of the outside of it and was pulling her. I could hear the fabric tearing in long, ripping sounds as claws and teeth shredded through the outer shell. Parker was screaming from the couch. "What's happening?" And somewhere above us, through the ceiling, I heard the concussive thud of adult feet hitting the floor and running. The dragging reached the wall, and there was a different sound. The sleeping bag being hauled upward, lifted off the ground toward the slit window. The window frame groaned. Leia was screaming in short, breathless bursts, and I could hear the fabric of the sleeping bag catching at the edges of the window, tearing further. I understood, with a sick, lurching horror, that whatever had her was trying to pull her through that window. An 18-inch wide slit window, 4 feet off the basement floor on the inside, but ground level on the outside. Something out there was hauling a child in a sleeping bag up the wall, attempting to drag her through it with the disturbing strength of something I don't want to share a world with. The basement light suddenly came on. Aunt Diane had hit the switch at the top of the stairs, and the bare bulb exploded the room back into existence. Every detail was harsh and yellow again, and suddenly, violently real. I saw the basement. The scattered sleeping bags and the crushed chip bag. The Ness still connected to the silent TV. Parker was now standing on top of the couch, his back against the wall. His face was white and his mouth was wide open. His hands were up near his chest, like he was bracing for a hit. And across the room, against the far wall, there was Leia's sleeping bag, hanging. The top half was wedged into the open slit window, pulled upward and bunched into the narrow frame. The bottom half hung down the wall, limp, with Leia's weight inside it, sagging toward the floor. The bag was shredded in long lines, 4 slashes evenly spaced across, and through the tears I could see the color of Leia's pajamas and even the skin of her arm. She wasn't moving or screaming anymore. She had gone silent, so absolutely terrified she'd stopped moving. Then the bag dropped. Whatever had been holding it from outside released it all at once, and Leia and the sleeping bag collapsed to the basement floor in a heap. From outside the window, inches away, just on the other side of that ground-level slit, I heard something move, a single heavy thud, the sound of a large animal pushing off the grass, heading back for the tree line, leaving us there in the aftermath. Uncle Cal came down the stairs 3 at a time, his face aghast. He grabbed Leia off the floor, sleeping bag and all, and carried her rapidly up the stairs. Aunt Diane was behind him, one hand on the wall, the other over her mouth, asking questions. Parker scrambled off the couch and ran for the stairs. I saw him glancing at the still open window several times as he did. I was the last one up. As I reached the bottom step, I too turned and looked back at that window. It was still open, swinging slightly inward on its hinge. Beyond it, through the narrow rectangle of the opening, I could see a strip of the yard due to the light that spilled out from the basement. There was grass, the first few feet of ground outside, and at the edge of the light already pulling back into the dark, there was a pair of eyes. They were low to the ground and caught the basement light like an animal's. A yellow reflective shine. They were close together, but that's all I could see due to the dark. They looked at me for less than a second, but then they were gone, and I swear I could hear the sound of something moving fast through the woods. I ran up the stairs, and I didn't go back down. Leia was physically fine. There were some light scratches from the window frame on her arms and shoulders, a bruise across her ribs where she'd been pinned inside the sleeping bag as it was pulled against the narrow opening. But nothing was broken, nothing that would leave a scar on the outside. Uncle Cal went out with a flashlight, walking the perimeter of the house, while Aunt Diane sat with us in the living room with every light on. Uncle Cal came back about 15 minutes later, said he couldn't find a thing. He started to explain it. It was a bear, he said, attracted to the smell of the food we'd brought down there. And I could see in his face that he was constructing something that he could believe, not something that was currently true, but something that would become true. There was no more sleep to be had that night. We stayed up in the living room together until dawn, with the TV on and the volume up, every light on in the house. Leia sat in the corner of the couch with her knees pulled to her chest and did not speak, nor would she speak in the morning or the morning after that, and she would not talk to me or the rest of us for the remainder of that summer. Aunt Diane called the hospital that night. She was in the kitchen and she was keeping her voice low, but I was in the hallway and I heard most of it. She described what happened. She used the word animal several times and the word window several more. When she stopped, there was some silence, long enough that Aunt Diane said, "Mom, are you there?" But then my grandmother's voice came through, and I could hear what she asked. She had said, "Were the windows closed?" That was her first question. Not if Leia was okay, or what happened, but about the windows. It was like she knew exactly what would have happened if the windows were not locked, or if someone had gone down into the basement where the windows didn't lock. Grandma, like Grandpa, probably knew what was out there, but did not have the first-hand experience like Grandpa had. Grandpa would not have forgotten to lock the place down. But Grandma, in a panic, well, I can't blame her. This was not her fault. I really can't say it was anyone's fault. We were driven home 2 days later. Our summer was over. I hope that makes you understand why the sound of a box fan brings me some sort of comfort, or security might be a better word, because my mind has subconsciously associated things with that event. It knows that before the attack, there was box fan noise when we slept, but on the night of the attack, there was none. So until the day I die, there will be a box fan running full blast in my room, because I do not want to hear what's lurking outside my window. What in the world was that? What kind of creature resembles a thin and sickly werewolf, but can fit through a thin window to drag away children? This story is going to give me nightmares for weeks to come. Good night. Thank you all so much for joining me on my podcast here, called Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails. You can listen to and review Unexplained Encounters on your favorite podcast app, such as Spotify or Apple Podcasts and so on. It's super helpful. You can find all my narrations on YouTube at Darkness Prevails. Until next time, everyone, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
The following story lacks evidence beyond the claims made within. Enjoy, but consider it fictional until proper evidence arises. Tornadoes are the one thing on this planet that is the closest to being a real-life Lovecraftian nightmare. I mean, just look up pictures and videos of these things. These emotionless, giant tendrils that come down from the vast sky to alter the fates of all of us below. This story comes from a user named CV Man, who shares a terrifying traumatic event. You see, he was a storm chaser, and a certain storm in 1985 convinced him that tornadoes are sentient. Hey, I'm a storm chaser. I don't think I've heard any storm chaser stories on your channel so far, so I'm sending you this one. Until 2010, I was a storm chaser. But my hands are the reason I quit. My doctor diagnosed me with rheumatoid arthritis. It started in my thumbs around 2003, and by 2010 I couldn't hold a steering wheel through a hailstorm without my grip going out on me. And you can't chase storms like that. It's already a dangerous hobby. You don't want to make it harder on yourself and other people. Obviously, it also makes it harder to hold a camera, or perform emergency tasks like changing a tire on a county road when a wall cloud is 2 miles behind you. So in 2010 I sold my stuff and gave it up. That would have been 30 years of chasing storms. I thought it would be a massive vortex doing me in, but no, it was my own body. When I tell people that I was a storm chaser, the first things you'll hear are, "Oh, that's so cool," or "Oh, that's so dangerous," which is then followed by questions of my closest calls. or the craziest things I've ever seen, and I've got several of those stories, all good for a porch and a beer. But those aren't the stories I'm here to tell you about. Truth be told, my wife does not like me telling this story, and when I tell it, my son always says that I'm crazy. Because this was the experience that made me believe something I've never been able to talk about. Because this is the experience that made me believe something that I've never been able to talk myself out of. And to be quite forward with you, it's this. Some tornadoes are alive. Not all tornadoes. Most of them are just weather, dumb as a rock, doing what physics tells them to do. But some of them, they know exactly what they're doing. And some of them even know when you're looking at them. This happened in 1985. Back in 1985, the data on tornadoes was rough, to put it lightly. There was no radar you could look at unless you were sitting in a weather service office, and they weren't going to just invite anybody in. There was no internet and no phone in your pocket to tell you a storm was rotating 6 miles southwest of you. What there was the morning paper, the TV forecast at 6 and again at 10, an NOAA weather radio that squawked like a dying bird, and a CB in your truck. Everything else relied on your own eyes and whatever you'd taught yourself. I'd been chasing since 1980 by then, which made me one of the older hands in a hobby that barely existed at that point. There were some guys in Oklahoma doing it, some in Texas, a handful of university people. They would caravan out into the plains every spring, radioing each other and swapping film. But in Arkansas, well, from what I could tell back then, not really anybody chased in Arkansas. And there's good reason for that. Arkansas is a terrible place for chasing. You've got hills, hollows, timber, road systems laid out by cows instead of people. You could be nearly under a tornado and never see it. So the chasers went west where the money shots were, and I stayed home most of the time because home is where I was. I sold cars for a living. People get an idea in their head that a storm chaser was some kind of scientist. No, I was a car salesman at a car lot in our little town of a few thousand. I wore a clip-on tie and sold F-150s to farmers. But storms were the other half of me, the half that would get up at 4 in the morning in April to look at the dew point out the back door. My wife, Magdalene, understood me as best she could. She used to fight me about going out there and putting myself at risk. But around year 2 of chasing, she stopped fighting me, and instead packed me sandwiches. My son Samuel was 9 at the time. He wanted to come with me so bad it hurt. I told him when he's 13, he could ride along, but not till then. He told me he'd be waiting. But he never did get that ride along, and you'll find out why. Now this brings me to Caitlin. Caitlin was my brother Dixon's girl. She was 11 back then. She had leukemia and was diagnosed when she was 9. But the most significant part about that is that she won. She was winning. I know, you probably hear about a sick little girl in a story and start to brace yourself, but Caitlin was on the good side of that battle. She'd been through the worst of it, and by March of that year, the doctors were telling her parents that she was in remission. Dixon called me at the dealership that day. He was so dang happy, and I was happy too hearing the news. I remember smiling so wide I nearly cried. She would be going back to school in the fall. 5th grade, a year behind, and she didn't care about that. So we're not talking about a little girl who was fading away, but a girl who was coming back to life. Dixon and his wife Ruth Ann lived 4 miles outside of town, down in this little valley. You'd come off the highway onto some gravel, and the road would start to angle downwards. The hills would begin to close up on you on both sides, and you're driving into a bowl, basically, with a creek at the bottom. Their house sat on 6 acres at the low end. A cute little white house with a tin roof and a big front porch that Dixon had built himself. That man could be insufferable about all the stuff he could build with his hands. There was a hayfield across the road and woods on 3 sides. I went out there twice a week, sometimes 3. I'd bring Samuel with me, and we'd say the kids were going to play together, but that was a word we used for the adults' benefit. Caitlin would get winded going to the mailbox, so mostly Samuel would sit on the end of her bed or out on the porch swing, and the 2 of them would talk for 2 hours about, I'm not sure, probably school and pretend stuff. They were good together. She was older and treated him like a little brother, which he loved actually, and would have died before admitting it. She had an opinion about everything too, that girl, She'd tell you your shirt was ugly and then tell you she liked it ugly. That leads me to the nightmares. You see, a month before all of this, Caitlin began to have these nightmares. Ruth Ann told me about them. She was scared they meant something medical, some pressure thing on her brain or a reaction to what they'd been putting in her. But the doctors checked and checked over and over and everything looked good. But she just started to have them. A few nights a week, she'd come up screaming out of a dead sleep, like a night terror. Then she wouldn't be able to stop for a while after she was awake. I asked Caitlin once myself about her nightmares. I did it when her parents weren't around. Heck, I waited until Samuel was inside to grab a Coke. And I felt bad for asking, but I did. We were outside on the porch, just her and me. And I said, "So your mom tells me you've been having some bad dreams lately." She went kind of shy or embarrassed. Then she replied, "They're not really dreams." "No?" "Well, a dream is something your head makes up." She started to pick at the arm of the porch swing, chipping away at some already chipped paint. "These are like something that's there." "What do you mean?" "I see a man in the field." I looked out at the hayfield across the road. I couldn't help it, and I didn't see anyone there. I'd never seen anyone in there, actually, since Dixon bought the place. "So what's this man do?" I asked. "Nothing. He just stands there, and he points." "Does he point at anything?" "Yeah, he points at our house." I laughed. I didn't mean to laugh. I just thought it was silly. Just a random and kind of eerie dream that a kid might have. And I even told her that was one heck of a boring nightmare, teasing her, and I got a laugh out of her too. Samuel came back with a Coke for each of us, and we talked about something else. I've thought about that conversation constantly since this happened, and I feel so guilty for laughing. At the start of that work week, there was news that some severe weather would be happening soon. It came in on the 6 o'clock news out of Little Rock, Arkansas. A man said that a system was moving out of Texas, and there was a chance of severe thunderstorms Wednesday and Thursday. Chance. That's the cover word, which basically, especially at that time, meant we don't really know for sure, so good luck everybody. I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer, but back then forecasts were a guess drawn with crayons, basically. It covered half the state. Severe could mean pea-sized hail and a good gust, or it could mean the whole town getting picked up and set down in a different country. You really had to look at the sky yourself and make your own judgments. On Tuesday, I got up early and stood in the backyard in my robe, drinking some coffee. I read what I could on the newspaper, watched what I could on the TV, and then I did my own judgments. The air felt strange, like air that didn't belong in our season. It was thick and warm at 6 a.m., and a low wind out of the south didn't stop or start, but ran steadily and constantly, like something was pulling it in. I went to work at the car lot, and I could not concentrate worth a damn. I remember giving this farmer too good of a deal on a new Ranger because I was too busy watching the window. By that night, the TV man had moved the crayon. Thursday, he said now. Thursday afternoon and evening, and now he was using the phrase, all modes of severe weather possible. Great, so now he was covering all his bases. A weatherman's way of saying no takesies backsies. But it also meant he was worried. He was telling us to prepare for the worst. On Wednesday morning, when I came into work, I went right to my boss and I asked if I could have a day off on Thursday. My boss, Ledbetter, was a fat but decent old man who had been selling Fords since Eisenhower. And he knew me. He knew why I wanted off before I told him. I had asked him in the past for the same thing before, for the same reasons. "Storm day?" "Storm day." He waved his hand at me. "Take it. Work Saturday if you can. And just don't do it in one of our demos, okay?" I laughed and said, "Okay, thank you." And I didn't. I chased in my own truck, a 1977 Bronco with a CB whip on the bumper, and a weather radio zip-tied to the dash. Because my mount had broken, I never fixed it. I had a Nikon and 4 rolls of film in the glove box and a box of county maps under the seat. The good ones from the highway department. They showed every gravel road and low-water crossing in the area. That was my radar, a box of paper maps and 5 years of guessing. On Wednesday night, I got the house ready. Magdalene was a big help. We had an interior hall closet, no windows, and we put in 2 couch cushions and a flashlight with fresh batteries. I also had my hard hat from a job I'd had at 19, just in case, for Samuel. But Samuel thought the hard hat was hilarious, because when he put it on, it came down over his eyes. "Ha ha, but you put this on if you hear the siren, got it? Don't argue with your mother either," I told him. "I know." "Say it back." "If we hear the siren, hall closet, hard hat, don't argue." "That's right. Thank you." The siren, I should say, was a joke out here. Our town had one up on the water tower, but out at the edge of town on a windy day, you would have a lot of trouble hearing it. And for my brother's place, well, 4 miles out there and down in a bowl? No, they would never hear it. Magdalene stood in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel while I ran through the plan. We'd done this plenty of times before. "What time are you leaving?" Depends. Probably 11, close to noon. I want to get out ahead of it." "Ahead of what? Nobody knows exactly what's going to happen." I grinned. "That's true. That's the question." She sighed and folded the towel over twice before hanging it on the oven handle. "I don't like this one. I've got a bad feeling," she said. "Oh, honey, you don't like any of them. And I'd have a bad feeling too if you were doing it. I completely understand." "No, you don't." She looked at me straight. "I don't like this one." I kissed her on the side of the head and went out to the garage to check my tires. I remember standing there with a tire gauge in my hand, feeling something in my stomach that I thought at the time was excitement. That's the thing about chasing a storm that happens in your own backyard. Every chaser wants the big one. But then that big one happens over your hometown where your kid goes to school, where your wife buys groceries, and you find out that the wanting and the dreading are the exact same feeling. There was one more thing on top of that too, this dreadful sense of loneliness. Because there would be no one else with me. I would be alone, and more alone than you think. There would be no other storm chasers here, not that I was aware of. The Oklahoma guys were not driving 5 hours east into the trees for a marginal Arkansas setup. There wasn't going to be a caravan coming here. There would not be another person within 200 miles, I'd say, doing what I was doing. Whatever came down out of that sky on Thursday, if anything at all, I would be the only man in the state pointed at it on purpose. God help me, I was thrilled about it, and also a little nervous. Let me back up the story a little bit. Before that night, just in the evening, we went out to Dixon's, actually. I almost didn't. The air was feeling like something was about to happen, and I just wanted to be at home, to get ready, and to be ready. But Samuel had been on me about it since Sunday. He wanted to visit his cousin. Plus, Ruth Ann had made a chess pie. Dixon was in the yard when we pulled in. He was working on the gutter with a pair of pliers. Dixon being ever the handyman. I swear he'd been fixing something on that house every day since 1975. He was 2 years my senior, and about a foot more stubborn. Ruth Ann was inside grading papers. She taught 3rd grade at the elementary school in town, and every flat surface in that house had a stack of something on it from August to May. Caitlin was on the porch swing with a blanket over her legs, even though it was 75 degrees out. Even so, she looked great. Her hair was maybe 2 inches long and standing straight up, and she made peace with that. She'd put on weight, finally, which for a kid in her situation was a victory. That little girl deserved a parade. So we ate some chess pie. Dixon and I argued about a football game from 4 years ago. Samuel and Caitlin ended up on the porch, and they stayed out there for a while. Through the screen door, I could hear the two of them going back and forth, and every so often we'd hear a laugh. Before we left, I stood in the doorway with Dixon, and I told him about the forecast. They're saying tomorrow afternoon, all right? Could be bad, so be on the lookout, I told him. They said that last month, he replied. I know what they said last month, and I'm telling you what I think. Dang, that bad, huh? I shook my head. I don't know for sure. Could be nothing. But if the sky goes green tomorrow, don't stand in the yard staring. Keep that culvert in mind. There was a concrete culvert pipe at the low end of the property, left over from when the land was farmland. It was 4 feet across and dry. That's the best they had. That house had no basement. and neither did 9 out of 10 houses in that town. I got the culvert, he said. But Ray, we already live in a hole in the ground already, referring to the valley they were in. Tornado's not coming down the hollow. I wish that's how it worked, but it's not, I told him. Well, I think that's how it's always worked. He was kind of right in that most people back then believed that. Every person in every hollow in the state believed it. They would tell you that tornadoes can't climb mountains, so they can't get to the valleys within. I let it go. We said our goodbyes. Ruth Ann sent us some pie home in foil. Caitlin gave me her biggest hug yet on the porch, and reminded me that she loved my ugly shirt, so I couldn't get rid of it. Then Samuel and I got in the truck and drove out. Samuel, though, I noticed, was quiet for the first mile out. Samuel at 9 years old was a geological event. That kid would never shut up. But eventually he did say something. "Caitlin was so weird today," he said. "What kind of weird you talking about, boy? Now don't be mean to your cousin." "No, not bad weird," he explained, "but happy." Is being happy a crime now? "No, that's not what I mean." He put his hand out the window and played with the air as it rushed by. "She was just really, really happy and quiet. She hardly said much the whole time. She sat there smiling and looking at stuff and laughing about stuff I said. Really, she only said one thing the whole time." "And what did she say, bud?" He pulled his hand back into the truck. "Well, I asked her if she was okay, and all she said was, 'I've been ready for a while.'" I looked over at him. Yeah, I know I should have been watching the road. Ready for what? What did she mean? "That's what I said, but she just smiled. She didn't say anything else about it." We drove another quarter mile, quiet, but then he said, "Dad, is she getting sick again?" Now, I probably made a mistake here, because when he said that, I thought he meant that he was scared she was dying. I thought he'd heard some making peace thing from Caitlin, so I told him clearly, no, she was doing better than she'd done in 2 years. I reassured him that she would be okay, and that was the doctors talking, not just me. When I said that, I felt like I was saying it to myself too, as if I also needed that reminder. But I kept on wondering, what did she mean? What was she ready for? Thursday, May 9th, 1985. I woke up at 4:30, and I could feel it right away, even in the house. Pressure and humidity. That morning my whole body was hollering, a storm is coming. I went out the back door in my robe and stood in the yard. It was 71 degrees out, and so humid the grass was wet without any dew having fallen yet. The wind was coming out of the south-southeast and already moving quick. A bad sign if you don't like severe weather. By 6 a.m., the weather radio already had a severe thunderstorm watch out for the southwest corner of the state. A watch means the conditions are right, but nothing yet has happened. 10 minutes later, that same corner got a severe thunderstorm warning, which means it has officially become a severe thunderstorm. In this case, there was hail coming down in that area. That was 2 hours away from me at the moment. I listened carefully to that flat computer voice reading out counties, and I felt my hands go cold. Magdalene made eggs. Then Samuel came in and ate his standing up. That boy was always in too much of a hurry or had too much energy, so my wife would make him sit down, which she did this time. This is all to say that that day was an ordinary morning. Before he left for school, Samuel asked me if I could get him a picture. "Yep, that's the plan, bud," I told him. "Dad, get a good one. Not like last time," he said. "A good one, okay. I promise," I replied. He got on the bus at 7:15 a.m. Caitlin wasn't back in school yet, so she would still be at home. At 8 a.m., I called Dixon from the kitchen phone. Ruth Ann answered. I could hear the radio going in the background, and someone eating from a bowl. "Hey, Ruth Ann, can I talk to Dixon?" I asked. "He's putting Vince up on the back line. Want me to run and get him?" "No, that's okay. Just tell him that this afternoon is getting bad. Storm should be here by 2 or 3 o'clock, probably. So tell him to keep the radio on, and don't be too far from that culvert, any of you." "Well, now you're scaring me a little, Ray." "Good," I said, then felt bad for how that sounded. "I'm sorry, just trying to look out for the family. And that culvert is the best setup you guys got. This doesn't mean something's gonna happen here. It's a big state. Just precautions." "Well, I've got school till 3, then." "Then that's perfectly fine. You'll be in the safest building in the county, I swear. Is, Caitlin there?" "Yeah, but she's sleeping. She had a rough night." "Another one?" "Worst one yet." She lowered her voice. "She was up at 2 and she wouldn't lie back down. She sat in the kitchen with the light on until 4 in the morning." "Did she say anything?" "Oh, Ray, she's talking about a man in the field. Said he moved. She's saying now he's not in the field anymore, he's in the road. Ray, I don't know what to do with this. The doctors won't even talk about it. They just want to do their normal tests on her." "So he's in the road now," I said, mostly to myself. I thought for a second, then followed up. "Look, Ruth, I'll come by tomorrow to check on everybody, okay? You have a good day at school. Stay safe." I hung up, and as I did, I was thinking at that moment, that's probably what 2 years of hospital stays does to a child's head, combined with the idea that she knew she was going to die, which she isn't now, but the damage is done, to her mental state. I went out to the garage and loaded my film, checking the oil in my truck. At 11:40 a.m., I pulled out. The plan was to go west and a little south, get on some high ground. If it was going to come, it was going to come from that way. There's an old fire road off the highway on Mabry Ridge, where you can see 20 miles west, well, on a normal day, and today was not a normal day. But here's what I saw at 12:15 p.m. To the west, there was a line of cumulus clouds going up. Not a wall of them, but individual towers spaced out. It looked like their tops were boiling over. Storms with that much room don't have to share. The base of the sky under those towers of clouds was the color of a nickel. I was sitting on the hood of my truck drinking a Coke. I watched the sky for a straight hour, and I was, I'll admit it, having the time of my life. Around 1:30 a.m., the tops of those clouds began to flatten out. They started to smear off to the east, way up high, like kitchen smoke hitting the ceiling. You see, air gets colder the higher you go, and warm air keeps climbing only as long as it's warmer than whatever it's pushing through. Somewhere around 40,000 feet, that quits being true, and the air up there starts getting warmer instead. A storm climbs into that and stops dead because there's nothing left to lift it, so it starts to spread out sideways, and the wind drags it downwind. That's the infamous anvil. And on 2 of those towers I could see a lump pushed up above the flat part, which is a storm hitting that ceiling hard enough to dent it before it gets shoved back down. What I was witnessing was real energy. The wind on the ground had swung around to the southeast. It was strong enough I could feel it moving my truck, and it was warm and wet, running straight toward those towers. I could feel the air around me being pulled past me, building into something out there. And it truly felt like I was standing at the edge of a building colossus. At 2 o'clock, the weather radio finally caught up to where I was. Now they reported a tornado watch on my county and 8 others, which was supposed to last till 9 that night. At 2:40, the first tornado warning of the day came in, 2 counties west, which meant somebody had either seen one or seen something on radar that looked enough like one. So I got in the truck, excited and nervous as hell. I drove down the ridge, going west on the highway, to get to the storm before it got to me. I wanted to stay southeast of this thing, always. That's where I could see it good, and where I'd be able to get the heck out of Dodge. The storm I picked up was the middle one of the 3, and by the time I got a look at the base of it, I knew I'd picked the right one. It was rotating, not so subtly. The whole underside was churning. One corner of it had sagged down lower than the rest, and was scooping up the loose torn cloud underneath it. I pulled over near a bridge, grabbed my camera, and spent half the film I had. My hands were steady though, despite the wind, but they would not be that steady much longer. The hail started then, dime and nickel-sized hail. I was 4 steps away from the truck before it went to full golf ball size, I put an arm over my head and ran, and my dumb self slipped on the gravel alongside the driver's door, and I felt and heard a crash at my hand. I climbed in and got the door shut and looked down. The Nikon I'd been holding in my hand I'd used to catch myself in the fall, so it smacked the ground. The back had sprung open and was hanging off one hinge, and the film had pulled out of the canister. The prism housing was caved in on the corner. The wind-on lever turned and didn't do anything. Great. I broke one of the reasons I was out here. I had 4 unopened rolls in the glove box, and nothing on God's earth to put them in. I was mad. Ooh, that was the maddest I've ever been, and I had no one to blame but myself. There were tornadoes possibly on the ground, and I was sitting there mad instead of scared. The best storm I've ever gotten to see, and I smashed my camera. Then I thought of the promise I made Samuel, and I cursed out loud. That was adding insult to injury, because now I'd broken that promise by accident. 2 minutes later, the hail got even bigger, and the noise inside my Bronco was like being inside a snare drum. Suddenly, a big piece of ice shot through my windshield, leaving a hole the size of a quarter. I drove east, driving through the worst of rain and hail I've ever seen, and I came out the other side, where the world went quiet. God, that's eerie. Nothing says something bad is about to happen more than the world going quiet. That's when I saw the birds. There were about 50 birds. Blackbirds, grackles, something like that, and they were all flying west, into the storm. And they weren't being scattered or blown by the wind. They were in a formation, flying straight into the blackest part of that wall cloud. I've been around birds and weather my whole life. They're smart creatures with extra warning. They fly away before humans even know what's going on. And that was the only time I've seen them flying towards the danger. In all my years, I never saw that again. I watched them go in, and I didn't see them come out. Chasing storms at close range with very bad light. Your eyes can lie to you. The clouds begin to take shapes that you want to give it, instead of what it actually is. People, animals, buildings. I knew that back then. It had fooled me 100 times, and I'd learned never to trust anything I saw for less than 3 seconds. At 3:05, I was going down this old back road, about 1.5 miles east of the wall cloud, which is the big lowered block of cloud that tornadoes love to drop out of. The trees gave way to a soybean field, so I decided to pull over again. The wall cloud was southwest of me, but it was turning quickly, getting turbulent at the bottom. Lightning was constant in the back of the storm, and every couple of seconds the field would light up green-white, then go dark again. On the 3rd or 4th flash, I swear to God, there was a man standing in the middle of the soybean field, couple 100 yards out, facing me, arms down at his sides. Then it went dark again. I waited for the next flash of lightning, and there he was still, but now one arm was up. He was pointing east-northeast, past my truck, and off to my left. I hollered something out loud, but I don't remember what it was. I grabbed my binoculars and looked through them, waiting for the next flash. But when it came, there was no one in that field anymore. Just soybeans. I put the binoculars down, saying out loud, "What in the world?" Lo and behold, the storm turned east-northeast about 4 minutes later, where the man had been pointing. I know, a storm's gonna go the way it wants, not where a man is pointing. That's what I was thinking at the time. What a weird coincidence. I still can't believe that I didn't connect that man to Caitlin's dreams until much later. At 3:12, the tornado came down. I saw the entire thing start to finish. Usually you get there and it's already down, or you're behind trees or a mountain, and all you might ever see is a gray wall. But I saw a hook of cloud come down off the southwest corner, spinning, and under it on the ground a ring of dust and trash kicked up. The ground vortex and the cloud met in the middle. That part took about 45 seconds. And when they met, the full thing condensed all at once, from the center out. It was gray-white and thin at first, like a rope. I remember thinking it might be a skinny one, and this would all be done in 3 minutes. It wasn't. About 1.5 minutes later, It went from a rope shape to a cone, and from a cone to a full-on wedge, and by then I could hear it. And let me tell you, when people say it sounds like a train, it does not sound like a train. A train is rhythmic. This was a flat-out roar that never changed pitch, a sound so low and high at the same time, I could feel it in my very bones. And hearing it that close for the first time, I did not like it. I reached inside my truck for my camera, then remembered it had been destroyed. So I stood there and I watched the most spectacular and terrifying phenomenon. What I did not expect to see were the tendrils. Listen closely, this part is documented, and any meteorologist will tell you the same. Big tornadoes aren't usually one tornado. They are strong ones that develop smaller vortices around the main circulation, suction vortices, that whip around the inside of the wall. That's why you'll see one house flattened and the one beside it barely touched. It's not the tornado being choosy, it's those things carving up the ground as they go around. And sometimes, in a really strong one, they don't stay vertical. They can tilt over. You'll get one lying almost flat, coming out of the side of the funnel and curling around it. There's film of this from Oklahoma and Kansas. Look it up and prepare to be terrified. So when I tell you that at 3:20 in the afternoon I watched that tornado put out arms, I want you to know that the physics back me up. But knowing the physics does not prepare you for seeing them. There were 4 or 5 of these tendrils. They came out of the side wall horizontally. They had to be 20, maybe 30 feet thick, and each extended out 100 yards, maybe 200, curling and feeling along the ground. One of them touched down for a moment at a patch of trees, and I watched that patch get erased. That's what it looked like to me from 1.5 miles away. It looked like something reaching out and touching things to see what they are, only to disintegrate them. One of these tendrils came out of the north side and went out over an open pasture, and it stopped, hanging there and turning. There was nothing out there for it to do. It hung for 8 to 10 seconds, then drew back in. I lowered my binoculars, and I could feel my stomach turning even more. Around 3:25, the rain thickened, taking my visibility with it, so I had to reposition. That's where I made my first awful decision. Instead of driving south, I ran through a gravel road east, trying to beat it to the next hard road. The gravel turned to mud, and before I knew it, I was going uphill. It took much longer than expected going through there on 4-wheel low. My back end was sliding and the roar was getting louder behind me. I was scared the tornado would be on top of me, and I would never see it coming. When I finally made it back out onto pavement, I was way closer to it than I wanted to be, only 800 yards. I came out onto a blacktop road with a fence line on my right. The tornado was right there off my left shoulder, so I stopped the truck right there in the middle of the road. There was nothing I could do at that moment. My legs were trembling so hard I could barely drive. The engine was running and the wipers were going full blast. I sat there and watched this monster. The sound of it changed. That flat roar just dropped away, and the debris that had been going around the outside of it, looked like boards and sheet metal and dirt and God knows what, began to slow down. Everything got quiet enough that I could hear my own wipers again. Then I saw more arms coming around. 2 more tendrils or offshoots came out of the near side. One was high and one was low, and they were coming towards the road, in my direction. Unlike the ones I saw before, they weren't curling up or feeling along the ground. They came out straight and stopped, both of them at the same time, about 200 yards from the front of my truck, and they held right there. It felt like I was being pointed at. A massive monster of nature sprouted arms and pointed at me. No, that sounds crazy. That's what a crazy man would say. I don't believe a tornado has eyes. These things don't have a face or a brain. It's a column of air with a pressure deficit. But there's a thing that happens to you when a deer comes up out of the ditch and looks at you. There's a moment where you realize that the thing across from you has become aware of you. To it, you've basically gone from being scenery to a subject. Every animal on Earth knows that feeling. It's older than we are. That is exactly what happened to me on that road. Every hair on my arms stood up, and my mouth went so dry. My entire body all at once, with total certainty, was thinking one thing. It just noticed you. And like some prey animal, I didn't move. I couldn't move. Out in front of the tornado on the ground, right at the edge of the debris where the dirt was still being pulled up, a familiar figure was standing there. Yes, standing there, basically in it, where the wind would have been strong enough to take the pavement off the road. Lightning flashed, and I saw him for a split second. His dark shape and arms at his sides. How was this man not being hit by debris at the very least? It went dark again, and there was another flash right after. As before, his arm was up, and he was pointing east-southeast. Not at me, but past me, off my right shoulder down the road, out over the hills. I turned my head and looked where he was pointing. There wasn't anything out there but green hills and rain, with 8 or 9 miles of Arkansas. When I looked back, the tornado's tendrils had drawn back in. The debris spun faster like before, and the roar came back, so loud it almost deafened me. I even flinched hard enough to hit my elbow on the door. I swear to you, I saw that tornado turn east-southeast, going the exact way the man had been pointing. Storms in this part of the country move northeast. All day that one had gone east and east-northeast, right along with every other storm in the state. But I was there. I watched it stop, look at me, and change course. This mile-wide tornado, seemingly at the behest of a strange figure on the ground. That's the moment. If you ever wondered why some old man in Arkansas thinks tornadoes are alive, that's the moment I decided. I got the truck moving. I drove east on the paved road, and about 2 miles down the road my brain came back online, and I realized I needed to find out where this thing was going. I pulled off at a wide spot and pulled out my collection of maps from under the seat, spreading the top one across the steering wheel. I put my finger on the map at the bridge where I'd wrecked my camera, and I traced where I saw it go. East, east-northeast, and now east-southeast, from about where I was sitting. I ran my finger out along that line. My finger went across the creek, across the north end of Mabry Ridge, and then down into a little pinched-in green place on the map which had a thin blue line running through the bottom, labeled Cade Hollow. I sat there, staring at my own finger on that map. I didn't want to believe it. I told myself it would be on the ground 25 minutes, thin out, then die, like most of them do. Or at least the ridge would kill it. But then I looked out the windshield at the sky southeast of me. The storm was still going, and still going in the direction I didn't want it to. It was going to Cade Hollow, right towards Dixon's house. The man in the field was pointing at that house. He always had been. I floored the truck, tearing up part of the pavement or part of my tires. Probably both. At that moment, there were 3 things I could think to do. First, I would make a call. There was a store at the junction of that blacktop on the highway, a place called Reddick's, which sat on cinder blocks and sold bait and beer. It had a payphone on the outside wall. I was able to get there in about 6 minutes. I jumped out of the truck, never shutting the door, and I yanked at the payphone. No dial tone, not even static. A line was down somewhere, so calling would not be an option. I went inside then. The old man behind the counter had a transistor radio. He let me give it a go, but nothing still. I later learned I came in kind of like a lunatic. He later told a deputy that a man came in, pale as could be, yelling about a poor girl in a valley, then left after trying the radio. The second idea was the CB. I was back in the truck and up on the highway with the mic in my hand going through channels. 19 first, then I tried 9, the emergency channel, which somebody was supposed to be monitoring, but no luck. Then I went back to 19. I heard some voices. It wasn't dead. There were people out there talking, but it was faint. What I could hear sounded like multiple conversations bleeding over each other from a long way off. And a lot of it wasn't even local. If I contacted anyone this way, I knew it would be no one who could get to a phone in town within 10 minutes, and nobody who even knew what Cade Hollow was if I told them. Then on Channel 9, in between two of my own transmissions, I heard a voice. It sounded like a girl, coming in clear, and there were two words that did not sound scared in the slightest. And what I heard was, "It's okay." I swear to God, that sounded like Caitlin. But my brother didn't have a CB radio, so I must have been hearing things, right? Tell me I was just hearing things. The third idea I had, and the only option left, was to drive. So I kept going. That highway going south is 9 miles from that junction to the Cade Hollow turnoff, with 2 sharp and blind curves and a steep hill coming down the ridge. I made it in a little under 8 minutes. I passed a Cutlass on the shoulder with its flashers on, and 2 people in it, looking up out of the windshield, probably thinking I was insane for still being on the road. The storm was on my right the whole way, and I watched it, and I couldn't help thinking that if I could see it, it was still watching me. It was in the trees on the ridge by then, and the base of it was so wide, it looked like the sky had come down and planted itself on the ground. Out ahead of it was a brown-green smear that was pieces of things it was lifting off the ground. At one point, I saw a sheet of tin about a half mile off my right side, up maybe 400 feet, spinning like a frisbee. Looked like some kind of fantastical bird. I finally made it down the hill. There was already a pine down across the westbound lane. I got around it on the shoulder, and I made the turn, starting down the gravel. Then, about 200 yards down that road, the road tilts downhill steep enough that the road tilts downhill so steep you have to ride the brake the entire way, and the trees on both sides lean in, completely eclipsing the view above you. You're driving through a tunnel, basically, and you cannot see the sky at all. No sky means I could not see where the tornado was, which way it was moving. I had no idea how much time I had left. There's only the one road in, same road out. It would take me 4 minutes to reach that house from here, but I knew it was coming down the ridge above me already. So I was driving blind, going downhill into the exact place that I knew it was going. All the while, that tornado was so big, it could pick up my truck and set it in a tree in a different state. No matter how fast I drove, my turning stomach was telling me I wasn't going to get there in time. It would get there before me, and if I got there any earlier, I would just die with all of them, and Samuel would grow up without me. I slammed on the brakes. I put the truck in park in the middle of that gravel road, and I got out, just standing there. Oh God, I could hear it. It was so loud it wasn't even a sound anymore. It was just sheer, pure pressure. It was definitely coming down the ridge into that hollow with everything it had. And that was a lot. I yelled. I stood on a gravel road in the middle of nowhere, and I yelled my brother's name into a tornado that could have swallowed a freight train. And just a moment later, all at once, it got dark, extremely dark, and the rain began to go completely horizontal. Something hit my truck behind me so hard it left a dent the size of a bowling ball. I got down on hands and knees in the ditch on the uphill side, and I put my face in the dirt, my arms over my head, and I stayed there. It went over the top of me, but it didn't get me. It continued down into the hollow, and all I could do was lay in that ditch, feeling my ears popping painfully twice. All of it lasted about 90 seconds before the sound started to fall off. I got up. I was caked in mud. I had a cut on the back of my hand. I don't remember how it got there. The rain had stopped. That's how fast it ended. The rain was just over, and the light around me was getting lighter. There was a wind coming up the hollow now, moving in the opposite direction of the storm. I got in my truck and I drove down, carefully. The place was a mess. The road was blocked multiple times. There was a hardwood tree down across the gravel at one point, 30 inches across, and by then I had to get out and do the last half mile on foot. I came around the last bend at a jog. The hayfield across the road was gone. It had been scoured to bare red mud, like the entire field all at once had been placed in a blender. Yet only meters away from that was green grass untouched. Dixon's truck was in the tree line about 150 yards from where it had been parked. It was upside down and folded like a wet napkin. And where their house had been, there was nothing. Just an empty, clean foundation. I expected to walk in on a pile, on a wreck that could be searched through, but there wasn't even that. I recall walking damaged paths with the weather service once. I got to see what an F4 does to the frame of a house. It's a debris field. It's a 100-yard path of destruction of lumber and insulation. Somebody's clothes in a tree, somebody's life destroyed. But this wasn't even that. There was a slab and a set of concrete blocks, some pipes coming out of the ground. But all of it was bare, and I mean clean. The winds were so violent that they sandpapered everything clean. Rainwater gathered in one spot and had already gone still. Not one board of that house was left. The porch was gone down to the anchor bolts, and the bolts stood up out of the concrete with the nuts still on them. You know what's awfully funny? The damned chess pie foil dish from Wednesday night was sitting in the yard, 20 feet from the slab upright, with nothing in it. I walked around the foundation in a stupor, twice, calling out. For a decade, there had been a house here, and inside had been the warm and smiling faces of my brother, his wife, and my niece Caitlin. But the only thing truly spared was the chess pie foil dish. They found Dixon at 7 p.m. He was in the fence line at the back of the property, a few hundred yards from the house. He was still in his work clothes he'd put on that morning. The deputy who found him was a kid I'd gone to school with. He came and got me personally. Ruth Ann had been spared, as she had been at school working. She'd apparently been in the interior hallway with 31 third graders on their knees with their hands over their heads, listening to a hailstorm pelting the roof. She had tried to call home at 4:15, but no calls were getting through. She finally got home at 6:30 p.m. Somebody had to be with her when she came down that road, to brace her, and it ended up being me. That's the worst thing I ever had to do. They never found Caitlin. They looked for 11 straight days. 200 volunteers by the second weekend, National Guard and dogs too. They walked the hollow and the creek and both ridges in a grid with flagging tape. They dragged the creek, and they pulled apart every pile of debris in a 2-mile radius. And there wasn't much to find, because there wasn't much debris. They found things: a sock drawer intact in a pasture a mile and a half northeast, photographs stuck to the side of a barn, the owner of which brought me the photos himself. Funny enough, it turned out to be the man I'd sold that Ranger to on Tuesday. But no, they never found Caitlin. Ever. I later got word from the surveyors, the folks from the weather service that come out to rate the damage. They told me it was an F4, the second worst there is. They rate it by damage done, and he mentioned whatever kind of tornado this was, it left a lot more absence than damage. And the worst thing he told me was that the damage path ended exactly at Dixon's house. What are the chances, huh? A tornado came down miles away and beelined its way right to my loved one's location. It was on the ground for 29 minutes, and it traveled a full 13.5 miles, all just to go and ruin lives. And that's my story. For Caitlin's sake, I continue to chase for 25 more years. A lot of stories like this end with, "Oh, you sold everything and quit right away." but that wasn't me. I was out again in June and every spring after that, until my body started to complain. And the reason I kept going out there was different now. I didn't go to see anything. I went to watch things. Does that make sense? Samuel never rode with me. When he turned 13, I never brought it up, and neither did he. Magdalene doesn't like when I tell this story. Brings back too many bad memories. And plus, she doesn't believe the, crazier aspects. I'm not here to try to prove anything to you. I'm simply here to tell you what I believe. I think some tornadoes are sentient. I think when they come down and touch the ground, there's somewhere they need to go, and they won't stop until they get there. Did it choose my brother's house? Did it take my brother's life and Caitlin's? I don't know. Just consider how cosmically horrifying a tornado is, how little we still know about them. The most terrifying moving thing on this planet, and yet it's not alive? Or is it alive in a way that we don't yet understand? I know lives have been lost and upturned by tornadoes in the United States, but I think they're cool. Sort of in the same way that you think Cthulhu is cool. Like you never want to actually meet the guy, are you crazy? Good night. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Tales from the Break Room. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. Make sure to follow and rate Tales from the Break Room on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. You can send us scary work-related stories over at eeriecast.com/submit. And if you want more scary narrations from me, you can find my podcast dedicated to unexplained and paranormal stories over at Unexplained Encounters, which you can find on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and your favorite podcast app too. Till next time, everyone, I've got to clock out, but I'll be clocking back in real soon, unless there's a severe weather alert. Folks these days fantasize about going off-grid, leaving it all behind and living alone in the wilderness, where you answer to nobody. It sounds like freedom. And for tonight's anonymous sender, a hunter and trapper living on 40 acres in remote Alaska, it was, for about 8 years. This story is called Becoming Hunted, and it's a deeply unsettling account of something that moved into this man's territory one fall. Something that he tracked, that he found, that one night came to his cabin and let itself in. If you live alone in the backcountry, keep your deadbolt locked, and whatever you do, don't follow the tracks past the creek. A buddy of mine told me about your show. He and I used to work the same fishing lodge before we went separate ways. But he's still one of 4 people who has my radio frequency. He called me about a week ago, and he told me to send my story in. But I told him I didn't really have a work story. I don't have a job in any way most people would recognize the word job. But he said to try anyway. So here I am, and I apologize in advance if this doesn't fit the mold. I realize the show is about work-related stories, and what I do is more of a situation than work. I live on 40 acres in the interior of Alaska, about 70 miles from town, by a road that is paved for roughly the first 30 of those miles, then transitions into a series of increasingly optimistic suggestions about where a vehicle might go. For 4 or 5 months of the year, the road is impassable due to snow or breakup, which is what we call the period in spring when the frozen ground turns into something with the consistency and reliability of pudding. I inherited the land from my uncle, who died in 2014. He left it to me because I was the only family member who ever visited him there, and I moved onto it full-time about 8 years back, after a stretch of life in Fairbanks that I don't particularly want to get into. I'll just say it ended, and I was glad it did. So let me explain the situation. I hunt and I trap for food. I'm able to sell some pelts, marten, lynx, beaver when I can get them, and I pick up seasonal work when it's available. Like firewood cutting for the lodge that my aforementioned friend used to work at. even equipment maintenance for a guy who runs a fly-in hunting operation. Between the pelts and the odd jobs, I can cover my property taxes, ammunition, fuel for the generator and the truck, the short list of things I can't grow, catch, or kill on my own. I'm not fully off-grid. I have electricity from the generator, a radio, a truck that works when the road does, and nowadays Starlink, which is miraculous, honestly. But I live alone by a margin that would probably seem excessive to most people. I've been doing it long enough, though, that the alone part is not a feature of my life anymore. It's just the foundation of it. I'm telling you all of this so you understand I know where I live, and I know what lives around me. I'm very familiar with the animal tracks in my area. I can identify species by track or sight. I can tell you from a scat pile what a bear ate 3 days ago, and roughly how big it was. I've had my up-close encounters too. I've had a grizzly in my yard, a moose on my porch in fact. One time a wolverine got into my storage shed and destroyed about 40 pounds of dried fish out of what I can only assume was personal malice. None of that ever scared me. Pissed me off, yeah, but never scared me. All of that is just Tuesday when you live out here. But what I'm about to describe to you is different. And it scared me badly enough that I haven't told anyone until now this experience that happened over 14 months ago. I run a meat cache about 200 yards north of my cabin, set back in the trees at the edge of a birch stand. If you're not familiar with the setup, a cache is basically a raised platform. Mine is built on 4 posts about 10 feet off the ground, with sheet metal wrapped around the posts, so animals can't climb up. You hang or store your meat up there, and the height and the metal keep the bears out, which is the entire point. Because if you're storing game meat in bear country and you don't cache it properly, you're gonna wake up one morning to a grizzly in your yard who has decided your food is his food. And that kind of confrontation ends badly for someone, regardless of how it plays out. My cache has worked for 8 years. I've had bears investigate it, I've found tracks around the base and claw marks on the posts, but nothing has ever gotten up the platform. The metal works and the height works. The system just works, which is why I was genuinely confused when I walked out one morning in late September and I found the crossbar snapped and the platform listing sideways, about 30 pounds of moose meat scattered on the ground. My first response was annoyance, because 30 pounds of moose represents roughly 2 days of hunting and butchering work. And the damage to the cache meant at least another day of repair before I could store anything else. I thought it was a grizzly that had gotten lucky or gotten big enough to just brute force my design, which can happen. A large enough bear can reach higher and pull harder than the cache was built to withstand. I gathered what was salvageable, which wasn't a lot. Most of it had been on the ground long enough to attract smaller scavengers. After that, I began to look at the tracks around the base. This is the part where things started to bother me, and I want to be precise about it. I'm aware of how this is going to sound as it goes on, and I'd rather you trust the early details so the later ones have something to stand on. The tracks around the cache were bear-like in their general characteristics. Large, 5-toed, with claw impressions forward of the toe pads. If I'd glanced at them while walking past, I would have said black bear, maybe a young grizzly, and I would keep going. But I wasn't glancing. I was crouching over them in good light on soft ground, which is about the best tracking conditions you can ask for. And what I was seeing in those conditions did not line up. The stride length was inconsistent. An animal walking at a steady pace leaves a regular pattern. The distance between its left front and left rear print stays roughly the same from one cycle to the next, because the animal's legs are a fixed length and its gait is a fixed rhythm. These prints varied by as much as 6 inches within the same trail over flat ground. The animal was not speeding up or slowing down. There was no change in the depth or angle of the impressions that might indicate a change in pace. It was just walking, and its stride was shifting as though its legs were changing length between steps, which is a sentence I'm aware makes no sense. I'm just telling you what was on the ground. The claw impressions were strange too. Some prints showed claws fully extended and dug deep into the soil. A bear's claws register the same way when it's pushing off for speed or gripping for a climb. The next print in the sequence would show the claws barely there, just faint arcs ahead of the toe pads, retracted or reduced. Bears don't do this. A bear's claws are actually fixed. They don't retract like a cat's, and their length doesn't vary from one step to the next. And the weight distribution. It shifted within the trail in a way I've never seen in any quadruped. The front prints would be deep and heavy, as though the animal was leaning forward on its forelimbs, carrying most of its mass on the front end. Then 4 or 5 steps later, the rear prints would be the deep ones, and the front ones would lighten up, like the animal had rocked its weight backward onto haunches without actually stopping or changing posture. I told myself it was an injured bear. A bear with a damaged leg or hip problem could produce an irregular stride, and pain could cause weight shifting. That was the best explanation I had, and I was motivated to accept it, because nothing else made sense. There's no way I was reading the tracks wrong, and I wasn't really prepared to think that the tracks were made by something that I didn't know. I followed the trail away from the cache because, regardless of what made it, I had to know where it was coming from and how close it was denning. If a bear is working your cache, you need to figure out if it's a transient passing through or a local that's going to come back every night, and the answer determines whether you scare it off or kill it. I'm not sentimental about bears. A bear that associates your camp with food is a bear that will eventually come through your door, and waiting for that to happen out of some kind of ecological kindness is a good way to die. The trail led north-northwest from the cache into the timber. Black spruce, mostly, with some birch mixed in along the creek drainage. The ground was soft from recent rain, and the tracks were clean and easy to follow. I moved through the trees with my .30-06 and my full attention, because whatever I was tracking was big, and I did not want to walk up on it from behind. About 1.5 miles from the cache, the trail entered a small natural clearing, maybe 60 feet across, where a few birches had come down in a windstorm the previous spring and opened up the canopy. I stopped at the edge of the clearing because I could see what was in it, and I needed a minute before I got closer. It was a moose calf, probably 2 days dead, based on the bloating and the condition of the exposed tissue. It had been killed and fed on, which in itself is not unusual. Bears kill moose calves regularly in the fall, and a calf kill looks more or less like what you'd expect from a large predator. One with torn hide, accessed body cavity, scattered remains, and a general mess. I've seen dozens of bear kills over my years. They can be ugly, but they do follow a pattern that I can understand. And yet this didn't follow a pattern. If you've got a weak stomach, I'm warning you now. The calf had been opened from sternum to pelvis along a line so clean, it looked like it had been done by a knife. The 2 flaps of hide and muscle on either side of the incision had been folded back onto the ground, spread flat, like how you'd place an open book face down to hold your place. The body cavity was empty, though. The organs, all of them as far as I could tell, were placed in a neat stack on the moss beside the carcass. They almost looked like they had been separated by type or arranged in size, roughly. Stomach and rumen first, followed by intestinal mass, then liver, kidneys, lungs, and heart, running largest to smallest from the calf's head toward its tail. They were evenly spaced. They were carefully oriented too, each organ placed with its long axis perpendicular to the line of the row. They had been put there with care, by something that had a concept of organization and the dexterity to execute it. I stood at the edge, just looking at this mess. I've butchered my game for 8 years, and I have a pretty thorough working knowledge of ungulate anatomy, and I'm telling you that what I was looking at was closer to a field dissection than a predator kill. Bears obviously don't arrange stuff like that. They're indifferent to anything but feeding, and feeding to a bear is a demolition event. They go in wherever they can get a grip, and they pull when something gives, and they eat what comes loose. They leave the rest in whatever state it lands in. But what happened to that moose calf required some degree of manual precision and a conceptual framework of sorting. No normal animal did this. And now I was thinking it had to be a person. But if that's the case, what did these tracks belong to? I made myself walk through the clearing, picking up the trail on the far side. The alternative was standing there cycling through explanations that didn't work, and that wasn't going to help me figure out what was in my territory. The tracks led north through heavier spruce, climbing slightly as the terrain rose toward a low ridge that separates my drainage from the next one over. I followed them with my rifle up and my head on a swivel, checking sightlines. I was stepping lightly, because there was something bigger than me in this area. Something that wasn't human and wasn't a bear. About a half-mile past the kill site, I stopped walking. The tracks had changed. Where there had been 4 sets of prints, 2 front, 2 rear, in the alternating pattern of a 4-legged animal, there were now 2. The front prints had disappeared. The rear prints had shifted inward, moving closer together, deepening significantly, taking on the weight that had previously been distributed across 4 limbs. The stride got longer. The gait was no longer the rolling, slightly pigeon-toed walk of a quadruped. It was now bipedal, 2 feet, alternating heel to toe, in a straight line through the spruce. I crouched beside the transition point and studied it. I measured the stride with my outstretched hand, roughly 30 inches, consistent, even. I looked at the depth and the angle of the impressions. I looked at how the toe area of each print bore the most weight, with the heel registering lighter. The signature of a creature walking upright with its weight centered and balanced, not some animal rearing up on its hind legs and lurching forward off balance. I told myself a bear had stood up. Bears do this, I think we've all seen the videos. They stand on their hind legs to look over brush or to get their nose above the ground level scent layer, and sometimes they shuffle forward a few steps while upright, before dropping back down. What I had never seen before, though, was a bear maintaining a consistent bipedal stride for what I paced out to be roughly 40 yards through timber, walking between trees, navigating roots and uneven ground. The gait was so smooth and regular that the spacing between prints barely varied by an inch over the entire stretch. Whatever walked upright through those spruce trees was not shuffling. It wasn't struggling to maintain balance either. This thing was walking the way I walk, easy, fluent, with a body clearly designed for exactly that posture. After 40 yards, the tracks spread again. The front prints reappeared, the rear prints lightened, and the animal was back to 4 legs, moving north at a steady pace as though nothing had changed. I stood at the endpoint of the bipedal section, looking back along the line of tracks. I could feel something shifting in the back of my mind, some load-bearing piece of my understanding of what lives in these woods, adjusting itself under a weight that it was not ready for. I followed the trail for another quarter mile, but I lost it on a rocky shelf where a creek cuts through the ridge. The ground went to cobble and gravel and the tracks disappeared, and I spent the next 20 minutes working both banks, looking for where the trail picked up again. I couldn't find it. Whatever I was following had either gone up the creek on the rocks or had crossed and continued on ground hard enough not to make an impression, and either way I was done for the day. A bit confused, I went home. I ate some dinner and cleaned my rifle, which didn't even need cleaning, but it helps to calm me down. I went to bed, and I didn't sleep terribly well. In the morning I went back out. Whatever was in my territory was probably still there, and I needed to know what I was up against. I want to be clear about something before I keep going. I'm not a guy who sees things in the woods. Again, I've been out here for 8 years, alone, and I've never once scared myself. I don't hear voices, I don't see shapes that aren't there. I don't tell stories around fires, because 1, there's no one to tell them to, and 2, I wouldn't tell them if there were. What I've described so far is what was on the ground in front of me, in soft soil, in good light, as legible and unambiguous as print on a page. I know what I saw and how to read a track as well as anyone in this part of the state. And what I read in those tracks was something that walks on 4 legs when it wants to, and 2 legs when it wants to, but can open up a moose calf like a textbook and arrange its organs by size in some neat little line. And I didn't have a name for it. Even now, I have no idea what to call it. I just knew it was out there, somewhere past the creek, in the drainage north of my cabin. And whatever it was, It knew where my food was. The next morning I crossed the creek, where I'd lost the trail. I worked the far bank for about an hour, moving upstream and downstream in widening arcs, looking for where the tracks might pick up again. The ground over there is harder, more rock, less topsoil. Not a place where you'd find impressions or prints unless conditions are perfect. I found a partial print though, on a muddy patch about 40 yards past the creek, heading north-northwest, consistent with the direction the trail had been going before I lost it. It was enough, so I kept moving. The country past the creek is land I know well, or I thought I did. I've hunted this area for the better part of 8 years. I was familiar with where the game trails cross, where the blueberry patches are, which south-facing slopes the moose like to bed on in the early fall when the bugs die off. Even now I could draw you a map of the major features from memory. Just in August I'd walked through this exact area picking blueberries, which is an activity that takes you over the ground slowly and thoroughly. That will help you understand what I mean when I say that the cabin I found 1.5 miles past the creek was not there 8 weeks ago. It was back in this small clearing in a stand of spruce. A great spot if you wanted to be invisible from any distance greater than about 50 yards. It was a log construction, roughly but solidly built. It had a stovepipe chimney with smoke coming out of it, a woodpile along the south-facing wall stacked neatly, at least 2 cords, a game rack beside the front door, just a crossbar between 2 posts with what looked like hides hanging from it, though from the tree line I couldn't tell what kind. The setup looked well established, like it had been there for several seasons. The logs were even weathered to a gray that takes years to develop. The woodpile had the compacted, settled look of wood that's been stacked and restacked over multiple cycles. A person glancing at this place would have guessed it was 5 or 10 years old, minimum. Like I said, I'd been standing in this clearing 8 weeks prior. I picked berries within 30 feet of where that cabin sat. There was no cabin. There was no clearing, for that matter. I stood at the edge of the clearing with my .30-06 across my chest. I looked at the cabin, and I tried to construct some scenario in which it could have been built in 8 weeks by one guy with no road access and no equipment. But I couldn't do it. That's nonsense. I'm no expert in log construction, but I've had enough experience with manual labor in the wilds to know what I was looking at represented months of work at minimum. But you know what else I saw? Those tracks, the ones I'd been following, they led right to the front door. I walked right up. That's what I was here for. Yeah, I know that probably sounds like the worst idea, even insane, after everything I just told you about the tracks, the moose calf, the bipedal stretch, and the suddenly appearing cabin. I get that, but the social mechanics of the backcountry are simple and deeply ingrained. And one of the primary rules is that you don't skulk about someone else's property with a gun. You walk up, you announce yourself, and you behave like a neighbor. You don't want to be mistaken for a threat out here, because that's how you get shot at. But also, I had to know what was making those tracks. But whatever I was thinking about those tracks, the cabin had smoke coming out of the chimney. Smoke means a person, and a person means you go say hello to them. I slung my rifle over my shoulder, and I walked across the clearing. I knocked on the door. The man who opened it was tall. I'm about 6 foot. I had to look up at him, which puts him at maybe 6'3" or 6'4". He had broad shoulders and a broad chest, and he wore a flannel shirt, green and black, with canvas work pants and boots. He was smiling before the door was all the way open. I didn't expect such a quick smile. That smile was already on his face before the door swung open, fully formed, as though he'd assembled it on the other side, then opened the door to present it. I want to say that people don't usually smile like that. When you open your door to an unexpected knock in the Alaskan bush, you're faced as a series of things in rapid sequence. Surprise, assessment, recognition or non-recognition, then the appropriate social expression, which might be a smile, or it might be wariness, depending on what or who you see. This man's face skipped all that. The smile was just there, wide and warm and fixed. It stayed at the same intensity for the duration of our conversation. and it never once reached his eyes, his gray or light blue eyes, which watched me with an attention that had nothing to do with friendliness. I introduced myself. I told him my name, saying I lived a few miles south, and that I'd been tracking what I thought was a bear that had gotten into my cache. I asked if he'd seen anything. This was standard Alaskan bush conversation. You lead with the practical reason for your visit, and the personal stuff comes later or never at all. He said yes, he'd seen a bear. His voice was fine, deep, unhurried, a normal man's voice with no particular accent that I could place. He said it had been around at night, and he'd heard it outside his cabin after dark. Then he said something that I'm going to relay verbatim, because ever since I've not been able to stop thinking about it. He said, "It comes closer than you'd think, right up to your door sometimes." Then that smile widened by a quarter inch, which should not have been possible, given it was already at full extension, and I felt the skin on the back of my neck prickle, like there was a threat right in front of me. We talked for another minute or two. He stood in the doorway and I stood on the packed earth in front of the cabin, and he didn't invite me inside, but I didn't ask to come in. During those 2 minutes I was cataloging things, not deliberately though. I wasn't in some investigative mindset, I was just looking around, and here's what I noticed. The guy was sweating. It was early October by this point, and the temperature was about 35 degrees, cold enough that my breath was visible, and I was wearing 2 layers under my jacket. This man was in a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, yet there were beads of sweat on his forehead, his upper lip, the hollow of his throat where the shirt was unbuttoned. His shirt was darkened at the collar and under the arms. He was not exerting himself. He'd answered the door from a seated position. I could see a chair by the stove through the doorway, and he was standing still while he talked. He was producing the sweat of a man doing hard labor on a summer afternoon, but it was 35 degrees, and he was just standing still in the doorway. His hands were kept behind the door frame for most of the conversation, resting on the back of the door or hanging at his sides, just out of my line of sight. But he did gesture once, a quick offhand wave indicating a direction, and I saw his right hand clearly for about 2 seconds before he pulled it back. It was a large hand. That was an understatement. His hand was disproportionately large for his frame, which was already a big frame, and the fingers were thick and long. The knuckles were pronounced and darkened, with something that could have been grime or discoloration of the skin itself. The nails were either very long or very thick, maybe both. I couldn't tell because the hand was withdrawn before I got a better look, and the withdrawal was smooth and casual, and it could have easily been coincidental, but it wasn't. The doorframe itself had marks on it, vertical grooves scored into the wood at roughly the height of the man's shoulder, deep enough to show raw wood underneath the weathered gray, evenly spaced lines running about 18 inches from top to bottom. They could have been made by some tool. They weren't made by a tool though. You see, tools leave flat-bottomed grooves, and these were concave, round at the base, the shape you get when something curved and hard like a claw, for instance, if I'm being direct with you, is dragged through wood with enough force to cut past the grain. There was a smell coming from inside the cabin that the wood smoke almost covered, but not quite. It had this warm and meaty quality to it, raw meat. I've butchered hundreds of animals, and I know what a space smells like when something has been killed and processed in it, and the inside of that cabin smelled like a killing floor. Underneath the wood smoke and meaty smell was something else. Musky, sweaty, smelled like I was downwind of a bear den in spring, but sharper, less diffuse, as though the source was nearby and concentrated. There was something on the counter inside, just barely visible past the man's left shoulder. It was dark and wet-looking, laid out on what might have been a cutting board or just the bare wood of the counter surface. It was too big to be a rabbit or a grouse, and much too dark, almost black, with a sheen to it that suggested moisture. It could have been a section of moose or caribou, but the shape was not right for any cut of game I could identify, and as I shifted my weight slightly to get a better angle, the man moved with me, keeping his shoulder between my eyes and whatever was on that counter. He did this quickly, and smoothly too, without breaking the conversation. I let him. because by that point, every part of my body was screaming at me to leave. I told him I appreciated the information about the bear. He told me to be careful out there. The smile remained. I turned and walked across the clearing toward the tree line with my rifle on my shoulder, my back to him. And God, walking away from that cabin was one of the harder things I've done in my life. It was like my every ancestor that ever existed was floating behind me, screaming to run. And the reason I didn't, I can't be certain about. It was something I can't fully explain. That running would reveal something about me, or maybe about him. For now, we were just two neighbors having a conversation. That's all, on the surface. And as long as the surface held, I was safe. But if I ran, that surface would break, and I did not want to find out what was underneath it. He watched me go. I could feel it the whole way across the clearing, and into the trees, and for a good quarter-mile after that. This focused, patient attention on my back that did not go away with distance. I kept my pace steady, and I did not look back. I breathed through my nose, and I counted my steps, because that took my mind off of things. Things like that man's hands and his smile, and whatever that dark shape on the counter was. I got home, locked my door, which is something I almost never do during the day, and I sat down at my table with the rifle against the wall within arm's reach, and I ran through explanation after explanation. That man was a squatter. People build in the bush without permits sometimes. They don't tell anyone. Some of these folks have no contact at all with the outside world. Alaska has more than its share of people who have opted out of society, and not all of them are stable. Some loner living in an unregistered cabin in the backcountry is unusual, but not unheard of. His sweating could be a medical condition, anxiety. He could have been stoking the fire. And he could have just had big hands. The smell could have just been game processing. A recent moose or caribou he got. That bloody smell can linger. Taken together, all of these things fall apart. The thing that made them fall apart was everything I'd tracked over the previous 2 days. Something with retractable claws and inconsistent stride that had dissected a moose calf and arranged its organs seemingly for fun. Something that led tracks all the way to his front door. I thought about contacting someone about this. The logistics stopped me. My radio can reach the fishing lodge 30 miles south, and from there a message could get to the trooper post in town. But what was there to report so far? That my neighbor has big hands? I could hear the conversation in my head, and it sounded like every other bush hermit call-in that the troopers have to deal with. Vague, paranoid, unprovable nonsense. I had no evidence of a crime. No evidence of anything, really. So I had to do what I could. I decided to stay out of the drainage north of the creek. I would hunt south and east, in country I knew, away from the ridge and away from that cabin. The season was getting short. The first hard freeze could come any week, and once the ground locked up and the snow came, the hunting would shift to a different rhythm. I needed maybe 2 more good days to fill the cache enough to get me through, and I could do that without going anywhere near the north drainage. I know how this sounds to your listeners. I know some of you are thinking I should have left and just driven back to town with a packed bag. I considered that. Honestly, I did. But this is my home. The only place I have. The only life that works for me. Leaving it because I'm scared. Because some anomalous tracks and a neighbor who made me uncomfortable. That would mean giving up everything I've built over nearly a decade. And I was not willing to do that. Not yet. Because at the time I could still file everything under strange but survivable. I stayed then. I hunted south and east. I repaired my cache and reinforced the posts. I kept my rifle close at all times and the door locked, and I stayed out of the north drainage. For 3 days, that arrangement was fine. But on the 4th night, it wasn't. During those 3 days, I found a boot print on the trail to my outhouse. It was in a patch of mud that I step over every time I use that trail. You see, I personally do not like muddying my boots. This wasn't my boot print. Someone or something had stepped directly in the center of it, and the print was certainly a boot, a lug-soled boot larger than mine, pressed in real deep. I wear a size 11, but this was bigger. I stood there and looked at it. Then I went to the outhouse and came back, and I looked again. After that, I went inside and locked my door. That same afternoon, I checked my cache and found a mark on one of the support posts. It was about 7 feet up, above the sheet metal. I found the same types of gouges that had been on that man's doorframe, but these were deep and fresh, cut through to the pale interior of the post. The sheet metal below the gouges was unmarked, which meant whatever had made them had reached past the metal from above, had reached up and over the barrier that was specifically designed to prevent reaching, and scored the post at a height that would require something with an arm span I did not want to think about. On the third evening, just before dark, I was bringing firewood in from the pile beside the cabin, and I smelled it. That same bloody smell, carried on the breeze from the north, faint and gone almost before I caught it. I dropped the wood inside and closed my door. I locked my deadbolt, and I sat in my chair with the rifle across my lap. I stayed put until I finally fell asleep sometime after midnight. On the fourth night, I went to bed early. Darkness comes around 6 in October here. My generator fuel is not unlimited. There's only so long you can sit in a 12 by 20 cabin with a kerosene lamp with your own thoughts before the thoughts start to win. I ate, I banked the stove, and I put the lamp out. The rifle was leaning against the wall on the left side of the bed frame, where I always kept it, loaded, safety on. I was asleep by 8. I'm not sure what time it was when the door handle woke me. I didn't check. What I know is that it was fully dark, and the stove had nearly burned out, which meant at least a few hours had passed, and the sound that pulled me out of my sleep was the sound of my thumb latch on the front door being depressed, slowly. The mechanical click of the latch bar lifting out of the strike plate was distinct in that silence, a small and precise sound that I have heard 10,000 times, that my sleeping brain identified instantly as wrong. You see, I'm the only occupant, and I was in bed. So me being in bed and that latch moving were two things that could not be true at the same time, unless something was wrong. The latch made it to the top of its travel and held there. Pressure on the door. The deadbolt caught it. I could hear the door flex in its frame, not from a shove or a slam, but the steady inward pressure, someone testing the limits of what the bolt could do. That pressure held for maybe 5 seconds. Then the latch lowered, gently, and the pressure released. The door settled back into the frame, and there was silence. I was on my back in bed, my eyes open and my hands already moving toward the rifle. I got my fingers around the stock and pulled it across my body, thumbing the safety off, lying there with a steadily increasing heart rate. Then I listened. Silence. Long enough that I started to wonder if I was just dreaming. Maybe I'd dreamt the sound. Maybe I was still dreaming. But I knew deep down it was my brain offering some courtesy, better than accepting the unacceptable. After 30 seconds to a minute, something happened. The window in the main room is a double-pane unit to the right of the front door, about 2 feet by 3 feet, and I heard a sound coming from it, a creak of pressure against glass, the frame flexing as something leaned into it from outside, testing the give. Whatever was doing it was careful and methodical. The pressure increased slowly until the frame groaned, then it stopped, and the pressure released, and there was silence again. I need you to understand what was happening here, because I think it's part of this story that I have the most difficulty with, even more than what came later. Whenever a bear wants to get into a structure, it pushes until the structure gives. It does not try the door handle, not on purpose. It doesn't test a window for flex, then back off and reconsider. What was outside my cabin that night was engaging in sequential problem solving. It tried one entry point, found it secured, and moved to the next one, and it was doing it patiently and quietly. It was not frustrated by failures. It was simply working through its options to get inside. I climbed out of bed. I didn't turn on a single light. I did not want it to know I was awake or what room I was in. In the dark, I at least had the advantage of knowing my own cabin by feel. I moved to the back corner of the main room, the corner diagonal from the front door, where I could put my back against the log wall and see the door and the window and the open doorway to the side room. The side room is where I keep my food stores, my tools, and miscellaneous equipment. It's about 8 by 10 feet, unheated, with a plywood floor that I laid over the joists when I first moved in. I stood in my corner, with the rifle up, and I waited. It circled the cabin. I tracked it by the sound of the logs creaking under pressure as something heavy leaned against the exterior wall and moved along it. It paused at the back window. There was a smaller pane of glass there, about 18 inches square, which I almost never opened. I heard that pressure on the glass again. The frame flexed, it released, and moved on. I then heard it pause at the stovepipe vent. It's a round metal collar that passes through the wall behind the stove. There was a faint metallic scraping as something touched or tested the pipe from outside. Then it moved past, and the creaking continued along the far wall, then stopped. I lost track of it, and that was disturbing. When it was moving, I could follow it, keep it located in my mental map. I would know how far it was from each potential entry point, where it currently was. But when it stopped, I had nothing to go on. It could be standing still against the wall 6 feet from me, separated by 4 inches of log, or it could have backed off into the tree line. Maybe it was doing something that I had not anticipated, and the silence offered no information. I stood in my corner with the rifle against my shoulder, and my finger along the trigger guard. I tried to control my breathing, which was fast and shallow and loud enough in the quiet cabin that I was sure whatever was outside could hear it. That quietness lasted for what I think was about 5 minutes, though time in that kind of darkness and that kind of fear loses its mechanical properties and becomes something softer, less reliable. 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 20? I don't know. What I know is that the next sound I heard did not come from outside the cabin. It came from underneath it. My cabin sits on posts. It's raised about 18 inches off the ground. Standard construction for permafrost country, where you don't want the heat from your floor melting the ground beneath the building and destabilizing the foundation. The gap between the ground and the floor joists is skirted with sheets of plywood that I nailed up in my first year to keep animals from dinning under the structure. The plywood was old though, and I had not yet replaced it, and I knew, even as I heard the first crack, that it was not going to hold anything that wanted through it. The sound was a splintering, flexing crack from the south side of the cabin, a sheet of plywood being pushed inward by something that was pressing against it from outside. And then the looser sound of the board giving way and falling flat. Then something was under my cabin, under my floor, and I could hear it moving beneath me. Something heavy. The scrape and drag of a large body pulling itself through an 18-inch gap between frozen ground and floor joists. The joists above it creaked as its back or shoulders pressed up against the underside of my floor, and the sound traveled from the south wall toward the north wall, toward the side room, and I stood in the main room, tracking it with my rifle barrel pointed at the floor, as though I could shoot through it, which I probably could, but I wouldn't. A 30-06 round through my own floor into a dark crawl space at an unknown target was not a shot I was going to take. It reached the side room. I heard it directly under the plywood floor in there, and I heard the boards react. The loose ones. The ones I'd been meaning to fix since spring, because the moisture had warped them and they didn't sit flush anymore. A board lifted. I heard the wooden clap of it tilting on the joist and dropping back, then another, further into the room, then a third, and this one didn't drop back. It was pushed up and aside with a scraping sound. Cold air came through the gap, and that musky smell came with it. thick and immediate, so strong it was almost a physical presence. That same animal and bloody stench from the man's cabin, but concentrated now, enclosed, filling the small space of my home. Something came up through the floor of the side room. I could hear it. The creak of the joists taking weight in a way they weren't designed to take. The scrape of the plywood boards being displaced. The heavy, effortful sound of a large body hauling itself through an opening that was barely big enough to accommodate it. And now, it was inside. I could hear it breathing in the side room, about 12 feet away from me through an open doorway in the dark, and the breathing was so deep and low, a sort of bellows sound that was too loud and too slow to be human, with a rasp on each exhale that made my chest hurt. It moved. Things fell off shelves, cans, I think, from the sound, and something heavier that hit the plywood with a thud. It was navigating the room, with a strange combination of power and caution, bumping against things then adjusting, and I could hear its feet on the plywood. They did not sound like paws or boots, but something with a heavy tread and a clicking undertone that could have been claws on wood, or maybe something else, but I didn't have a comparison for that. A glass jar then fell and broke, and the thing paused at the sound, and its breathing changed, becoming faster, shorter. Then it made a sound that I'm going to do my best to describe, even though I know I will fail. It came from low in the chest or the throat, a huffing sound, almost a cough. But underneath it, there was something tonal, something that rose and fell in a way that was closer to a voice than an animal sound, like a man trying to speak through a mouth that was not shaped for speech, or some intelligent animal actually trying to mimic the sound of a human. It wasn't a growl, and it wasn't a word, but something else entirely. Then, the shape filled the doorway. I saw it in silhouette, in the marginally less dark rectangle of the side room. And when I say marginally, I mean the difference between absolute black and something one shade above it. The side room has no window. What little I could see was defined by the faintest ambient glow from the coals in the stove reflecting off surfaces in the main room, and it was enough to give me an outline. And an outline was far too much for my brain. The thing was bent, compressed into a shape that fit under the 7-foot ceiling, but that clearly did not belong under a 7-foot ceiling. The mass of it was enormous, filling the doorframe side to side, and the posture was hunched, folded, a body that was too big for the space, and it was making continuous structural compromises to fit inside. The head was forward, extended on a neck that angled out from the shoulders at something close to 45 degrees, and the head itself was all screwed up, and thankfully the darkness then prevented me from fully appreciating what was there. I could tell, though, it had a long and heavy jaw, with a brow ridge that I could see as a horizontal shadow above the eyeline. The shoulders behind the head were the widest part, absurdly broad, and from the shoulders, the arms, or maybe the front legs, hung down well past the midpoint of the body, long enough that if it had straightened them, they would have reached the floor, even while it stood semi-upright. And the hands at the end of those arms were similar to the hands I'd seen in the doorway of the man's cabin, except they were even larger now. Or maybe I was just closer. And the fingers were curled inward, showing me exactly how long the nails were. But they were not nails. These were claws. It stood in the doorway, and I stood in my corner. We were 12 feet apart in the dark. I could hear that breathing and smell that bloody smell throughout my cabin like some sort of horrific gas leak. It knew I was there. I knew it did, since the first sound at the door handle. But I understood that with full clarity now, standing in that corner with my back to the wall and the rifle up. It had tested the door because it knew I was behind it. It had tested the windows because it was looking for a way to reach me. It went under the cabin, coming through the floor, and here it was now in my home in the dark, looking right at me. It took a step into the main room. The floor groaned and I felt the vibration through my boots. Its breathing shifted faster, making that noise again, and underneath it was a different sound, the rapid clicking from its mouth or jaw, almost insect-like, as if the teeth were working against each other, or the jaw hinge was opening and closing in quick succession. The sound was eager, and that made my blood freeze. My vision narrowed, and my hands went steady somehow. I think it was adrenaline, calming my nerves as I aimed the rifle towards it. I was going to fire. There was nothing else to do. If I didn't fire now, I would simply be killed, and I would not be here to tell this story. The last thing I wanted was to be in reach of those hand-like claws. I fired. A 30-06 in an enclosed log cabin is not a sound, it's more of a concussive event. The muzzle flash blew the darkness apart for a fraction of a second. A white-yellow blast of light lit the entire room in a single freeze frame. In that frame, and in that moment, we saw each other, and that image was burned into my head permanently. I cannot describe the rest of it. What I've already given you was the limits of my description. Everything else in my mind will stay with me, because I have no other choice. The dark came back in an instant. That thing screamed, and it was so human. A scream, full-throated and agonizing. There was surprise in it, a raw sound, so close to the sound of a grown man in pain, that my first instinct in the ringing aftermath of the gunshot was not relief, but guilt. I felt guilty for defending myself, as though I'd made a terrible mistake, like I'd shot a neighbor. It went through the wall, not the door or the window, the wall beside the doorway to the side room. An explosion of splintered log and insulation and cold air flooded in, and I heard it land on the frozen ground outside, and it moved, crashing through thick woods, heading north, heading toward the creek and the ridge, and probably that man's cabin. It took about 15 seconds before the sound of it moving faded to nothing. There was still a ringing in my ears, and a terrible cold pouring in through that hole in my wall. And that smell, it remained, now mixed with gunpowder. The silence of the woods at night after something so loud had happened, it was so bizarre, but relieving. Suddenly my legs buckled underneath me, and I fell down. I was suddenly on the floor with my back against the wall and my rifle across my knees. My hands, which were calm only seconds ago, were now shaking so hard I couldn't make them stop. I sat there until the sky started to lighten through the hole in my wall. It must have been about 5 hours. That whole 5 hours I did not move, and I did not sleep. I listened to the silence with an intensity that I think cost me something that I've yet to get back. At dawn, I got up. I walked to the side room and I looked at the floor. 2 boards were displaced, pushed up from below and shoved aside. The gap between them was maybe 2 feet wide and 18 inches across, barely enough for a man to fit through, and yet that thing had done it. There was blood on the edges of the boards, blood on the floor of the side room and on the wall where it went through. Dark and thick, darker than a man's blood. And the trail continued outside, through the shattered section of wall, across the yard and into the trees. I followed it for about 100 yards. I needed to know. The trail started at the cabin wall with boot prints, human boot prints in the churned-up mud and frost, a lug-soled boot larger than mine, pressing deep under a weight that was running. Over the next 30 yards, the prints changed. The stride went longer, and the shape narrowed, lengthening, the toe impressions deepening and spreading as the heel receded, and by the time the blood trail thinned and disappeared into the brush, the prints on the ground were no longer boots, and they were not human feet. They were something in between everything I'd seen so far, and they led north toward the creek. I did not follow them further. I patched the wall with plywood and 2x4s. I screwed the crawlspace skirting down with structural screws instead of nails, and I added a second layer. I reset the floorboards in the side room, bolting a sheet of plywood over them. I drove to town on a road that was already half frozen, buying ammunition and plywood, and I didn't tell a soul about what happened. I bought a new deadbolt and a padlock for the crawlspace access, and 80 rounds of 30-06. I drove home and installed everything, and I'm still here. I went back to the man's clearing 6 weeks after that, after the first real freeze. I took my rifle and I crossed the creek. I walked to the exact spot where the cabin had stood. There was nothing there. No foundations or log ends, no ash from a stove, no depression in the ground where a structure had sat. Only spruce and moss and quiet. If I hadn't stood in front of that cabin, knocking on the door and looking at the man's smile, smelling blood on the air, I would have said nothing, and no one had ever been there. What a disturbing story. All the more reason to stay far away from Alaska. Let the modern pioneers handle it. What do you think it was, though? A desperate bear? Or something like a bear man? Even a werewolf? Let me know. Good night. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Tales from the Break Room. If you're not listening on the podcast side, you're actually not getting a bonus story that I've narrated. So if you're on YouTube, head over to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Search for and follow Tales from the Break Room, and you'll be getting a bonus story for this episode. Till next time, everyone, I'll be clocking out. Don't worry, I'll be back again real soon. Hey there, YouTube viewers. This show is available as a podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Just search for Unexplained Encounters and give us a follow. Thank you. Do you ever get the feeling that a certain person you've encountered just isn't actually human? What if there are human-looking things out there that simply aren't one of us? The following story is titled, It Wears Human Skin. It's from a viewer with the pen name Garlini. It's one of the more unsettling stories I've read in a while. He claims to be a park ranger for an unspecified national forest. Things can be weird out there at times, but a series of events with striking similarity seems to prove that there is something out there in the American wilderness, and it loves to wear human skins. Forgive me because I'm no writer. I'm not very good at telling stories. In the past couple of weeks, I've typed this out about 4 times, deleting the previous ones. This is basically just the version I stopped editing, the version I settled on. So I'm a park ranger. I've been with the National Park Service for almost 8 years, all of it in the same district in the Northwest. For obvious reasons, I can't name the park, and I can't give my real name. But if you work in NPS and you're reading this, you either already know who I am, or you've heard a version of what I'm about to describe. And in that case, I would appreciate it if you kept it to yourself. I'm doing this to get the word out. I think people should know. My dad was the one who got me this job. He was a ranger in the same district for about 26 years before I started, which is how I even knew the posting was available. He called me one day and told me that they had an opening, and that the application window was short. I was 23 and working at a hardware store in Bremerton, going nowhere in particular with my life. So I applied. Now I wish I could say there was something romantic about it, some deep love of the outdoors that pulled me in, but truthfully, my dad handed me a life and I took it because I didn't have one of my own yet. I grew up visiting him on the job, weekend rides in the duty truck, helping him restock trail registers and eating peanut butter sandwiches on the tailgate, while he filled out paperwork. I liked those visits. What I didn't understand until I was actually doing the work myself was that those visits were curated. Dad only brought me along on the easiest of days. He never took me on a body recovery, for example, or out to look for a lost child or a 3-hour bushwhack to tag an injured elk for Fish and Wildlife. Basically, the version of the job I grew up seeing with him was a highlight reel, and I didn't really find that out until I was already on payroll. I should tell you that I'm not built for this work, not the way he was. Dad could spend 4 days alone in the backcountry and would come back looking 10 years younger. On the other hand, I spend one night in a fire lookout and my hands shake for an hour the next morning. I've been on sertraline since I was 19. I check the locks on my duty cabin twice before bed, then I check them again when I get up to use the bathroom at 2 a.m. I know the second check is pointless because I did it 3 hours ago and nobody has come in since. But I do it anyway because my brain needs the confirmation that everything is safe and secure. That's how my mind works. And I manage it. Most days I'm fine. I do my job well enough. Nobody's ever had a complaint about me yet. My performance reviews would say things like reliable and thorough, which are the words people use when they mean you're not exciting, but you do show up. Now let's truly get into the story. The first thing happened in my second year. Early September, the tail end of hiking season. It's around the time the days are still warm out, but the light starts dropping off fast after 5. We got a report from a woman at the main trailhead lot that her husband had not come back. He had left that morning for a day hike on one of the eastern loops, a 12-mile trail with moderate difficulty. The man was 44 years old and was experienced. He had done the route before, too. He told her he'd be back by 4, and at 7, she called us. This happens more than people think. Usually the hiker miscalculates time or twists an ankle, or just sits down somewhere pretty and loses track of the afternoon. 9 times out of 10, they walk out on their own, sheepish and apologetic, and you meet them on the trail with a flashlight while they're already heading back. Anyway, we started the search at first light the next morning. There were 4 two-person teams fanning out from the trailhead, each covering a section of the loop and the surrounding off-trail areas. I was paired with another ranger named Colby. Colby's a seasonal guy in his second summer who talked too much and hiked too fast. We were covering a section off the main trail, the east side, where the loop cuts close to a gully that feeds into the creek system below. It's dense in there. Think Douglas fir, western red cedar, ferns up past your waist in some spots. Lots of deadfall, too. Big old trunks gone soft with rot that crumble when you step on them. Not a place a day hiker would normally wander into. But we check everywhere because lost people don't go where they're supposed to, obviously. Colby was about 30 yards ahead of me, working a line closer to the trail, when I pushed through a stand of sword ferns and looked down into the gully. I found the body around 10 a.m. It was lying face up at the bottom of the gully, about 50 yards off the trail, settled into the ferns, like someone had put it there. It was flat on its back, arms at its sides, legs straight. The first thing that registered with me was how pale the skin was, but evenly pale. Like the color on the skin had been mixed in a bucket, then painted perfectly. There was no mottling or lividity, no discoloration or bruises. But then I saw the face. The mouth was open, real wide, far wider than normal, living or dead. I checked later and the joint was intact, no dislocation or displacement. The mouth was just stretched open, like the muscles that should have held it shut had simply stopped existing. The lips were pulled back from the gums, and the teeth were gone, most of them. They were scattered on the ground around the head, in the ferns and the dirt, like someone had dropped a handful of chiclets into the grass. I could see them, small and white, on the brown mulch. Some of them still had the roots attached, long, pale, tapered roots, intact and whole. They'd come out clean from the inside, it looked like, pushed outward through the gums. A few of them had landed 6 inches from the face. Whatever had forced them out had done it with enough pressure to scatter them. I called this in. Then I sat down on a mossy log about 20 feet away and waited nervously. When you find a body, you mark the GPS, you radio the coordinates, and you don't touch anything. A few minutes later, Colby came crashing through the brush. I told him to stay back, and he did, though he kept craning his neck trying to see past me into the gully. I told him he shouldn't look, but he looked anyway. He didn't say anything after that, which was the quietest he'd been all summer. I sat on that log for 45 minutes waiting for the recovery team. Colby stood about 10 yards behind me, texting on his phone, which technically wasn't supposed to get reception out here, but sometimes it did. I spent most of that wait trying to figure out what was bothering me, beyond the obvious. It took me a while, but then I realized it was the smell. There was no smell. A body in the woods in September, even one that's only been there overnight, should smell like something. Maybe not rot yet, but there's biology to it still. The system shuts down when you die. Sweat, waste, and the first stages of bacterial work. I've had the unfortunate pleasure of experiencing the heaviness in the air around a fresh body. And you notice that, even if you can't name it at the time. I'd been on 2 other body recoveries by then, both exposure cases from the previous winter found in the spring thaw, and both times the smell was what told me I was close before I ever saw the bodies. This one had nothing. I was 20 feet away and the air smelled like dirt and wet ferns. To my scent, it was just the smell of the morning fog burning off the canopy. The body was not, well, participating in the forest around it. It was like it was part of the scenery, a prop someone had left on the ground. The other thing I noticed while I sat there was the complete lack of insects. Again, I'll remind you this was September in the Northwest, in a gully with standing water and decaying plant matter. How were there no insects? Mosquitoes had been chewing on me and Colby since we left the truck. I had 3 bites on my neck alone, but the body had nothing on it. Nothing crawling on it or buzzing around the open mouth or eyes. Flies will find a dead animal in the woods within minutes. I'd been sitting there close to an hour, and that body was untouched. Like to nature, this was not a food source. Nature itself was treating it like it wasn't even biological. The recovery team hiked in around noon. They bagged it and carried it out, and I went back to the trailhead, doing my paperwork in the bed of my truck. I liked doing that because my office felt too small and too inside. Then I drove home and sat down for a while, waiting for my leg to stop bouncing. Here's the catch. That body did not match the missing hiker. Different build. The hiker was 6'1", broad-shouldered, a weekend weightlifter according to his wife. The body was slight, 5'8" at most, with a narrow frame. Completely different estimated age, maybe late 20s against the hiker's 44. They had different hair colors too. When the dental records came back, what was left to compare anyway, they didn't even match anyone in any database. Same thing with the fingerprint match. No missing persons report anywhere in the state fit the description. The medical examiner's report said cause of death was undetermined. They could find no trauma, no toxicology, no disease, no signs of exposure, no evidence of animal predation. The notes mentioned the jaw and the teeth, but framed it as anomalous post-mortem changes of unknown etiology. I read that phrase in the report and remember thinking it was a very comfortable way to say, I have no idea what happened here, and I'd like to stop thinking about it. There was one other thing in the ME's notes that I didn't understand until later. Under internal examination, a single line was there. Absence of expected organ weight. Thoracic and abdominal cavities presented without significant visceral mass. Noted for further review. Even after reading it 3 times, it still didn't click. I mean, I'm not a medical professional, so I wasn't sure what I was expecting. I didn't know what without significant visceral mass meant in practice. It would be years before I understood what that examiner was saying. That, in the most cautious language possible, they were saying the body was mostly empty. That further review part never even happened, as far as I know. The case stayed open, nobody closed it, and nobody pursued it. It just stopped moving. The missing hiker, the 44-year-old husband, he was never found. His wife called the station every week for 2 months straight, then every other week, then once a month, then she stopped. I wasn't the one who took her calls, but I was in the office for some of them, and the sound of someone's hope thinning out is not something I like to describe. You could hear it in the pauses between her questions, because those gaps got longer. No one connected the body in the gully to the missing hiker, because there was nothing to connect. It was a different person entirely, as far as anyone could tell. 2 unrelated events that happened to occur in the same area at roughly the same time. Coincidence or bad luck? Just the woods doing what the woods can do to people. Now, my dad was still alive back then, still working the district, same as he had been since before I was born. He was 58 years old, and his knees were starting to go, but he still hiked faster than anyone under 30 on the staff. I told him about the body over dinner a few nights after. Just the broad strokes. The teeth, the jaw, the ME's non-answer. He listened closely, never interrupting. He kept his eyes fixed on mine the whole time, and stopped moving his fork. Eventually, when I was done, he said something to me like, 26 years, and I've seen a dozen things I couldn't explain. The woods don't run on our schedule, and they don't owe us any answers." He said stuff like that. I don't think he meant it to be dismissive. He just had a way of putting things in a box and pressing the lid down flat, stacking something heavy on top afterwards. And when he did it, you believed the box would stay shut, and you wanted it to. So I let it stay shut. I was 2 years into a job I wasn't even sure I could handle on a good day, and I had a father who could look at the inexplicable and simply shrug. I wanted more than anything to be someone who could do that too. So I hid that memory in the same place I put all my memories that threatened to crack the floor I'm standing on. Somewhere so deep down that even the medication won't touch it. For a while, that worked fine. My dad died 14 months later. It was pancreatic cancer, caught too late. Apparently, pancreatic cancer is quite sneaky like that. He went from diagnosis to gone in about 11 weeks. I'm not going to write too much about this. After all, it's not what the post is about, because I still can't do it without my hands starting up again. I'll say this, he didn't complain, and he wasn't scared. On the last day he was conscious, he asked me how the trail conditions were looking for spring. That's just my dad. He died and I stayed in the district, and I kept doing the job. It kept me distracted. People told me he would be proud of me for keeping the job. Maybe. I think he'd be more confused than proud, honestly. He knew I was scared of everything. He just had the grace to never say it out loud. The next few years were quiet. I did my routes, took my meds. I got to know the other rangers who cycled in and out. Some of them were good, but some of them were just passing through on the way to get better posting. I found a rhythm that worked, as long as nothing disrupted it, which is another way of saying I built a life out of holding very still, hoping nothing noticed me. That body in the gully I found, sat in my mental box, and the lid still held. But I did think about it sometimes, late at night when the cabin settled, those moments when your brain decides sleep just isn't happening. But thinking about something and doing something about it are very different activities, and I've always been better at the first one. 4 years went by. Then they found the second one. Before I go on, let me talk about Philip and Richard. Philip Herrera started the same year my dad died. He was 24 at the time, fresh out of a forestry program. He could sit next to you at lunch for half an hour without saying a word, and you'd somehow enjoy the company. But he wasn't exactly shy. He just didn't start conversations. But if you initiated one with him, he'd ride it wherever you wanted to go, and he would remember the details weeks later. He once asked me a follow-up question about something I'd mentioned in passing about my truck's transmission 3 months after I said it. The thing about Philip was the horror stuff. He was into it. Some dudes liked fly fishing, hunting, but Philip liked scary stuff. Creepypasta, folklore, paranormal podcasts, VHS-era slasher films, the whole shebang. He had a bookshelf in his cabin that was half field guides, and the rest was paperback horror anthologies with cracked spines. When he first started, whenever he would meet a ranger in the district for the first time, he would ask them what the strangest thing they'd ever experienced on the job was. The only time he really initiated conversations. Most folks gave him nothing. It was stuff like weird noises or a tree that fell awkward, or the rudest hiker you've ever heard. He wrote all of it down in a little notebook. I was no exception. He asked me too. I had told him about the time I found a boot on the trail with no foot in it, and no owner anywhere nearby. I didn't tell him about the body in the gully though. Not sure why. Maybe because the boot story fit neatly in Philip's notebook, and the body could stay in the box. Then there's Richard K. He had been in the district for about 3 years by the time the second body turned up. He was 33, had previously did something with insurance in Portland that he never talked about, and I always assumed that meant he didn't like it. He transferred to NPS through some career change program, and took to it immediately. Richard was the guy who packed an extra Cliff Bar in case you forgot yours. He'd give you his rain shell if yours was in the truck. He named the chipmunks around the station and got genuinely upset whenever one of them stopped showing up. He was very soft-hearted, almost to a fault, but it was so genuine that it never really got there. The man cared about things openly and without embarrassment, and being around him made you think, dang, I wish I was like that. The three of us weren't best friends. We were co-workers who liked each other, which I think is its own rare and specific thing. We would eat lunch together when our schedules overlapped, and we would carpool to the grocery run in town sometimes. One time, Richard lent me a book once, and he never asked for it back. Philip and I watched a Mariners game at his cabin one night, but neither of us said much. But that was fine. We were three dudes who were comfortable around each other, and it didn't need to be more than that. It was my 6th year, in late October. A couple in their 30s had reserved a backcountry campsite on the North Fork Trail, a 2-night permit. When they didn't check out on their scheduled date, and their car was still in the lot the following morning, a search was initiated. Their campsite was found and intact. The tent was still staked, and there were sleeping bags inside, a cook kit hanging from the bear wire. There were 2 packs leaning against a log, food still in the canister untouched. We could not find any sign of a struggle, no sign of anything at all. It looked like 2 people had stepped away to get water and never came back. The car in the lot had a coffee mug in the cup holder with a ring of dried milk in the bottom. I was on the search team with a ranger named Gillette. We were working a grid pattern north of the campsite, pushing through heavy brush along a deer trail that followed a ridgeline. About a quarter mile out, in a thicket of salal and Oregon grapes so dense I had to turn sideways to get through it, I saw the body. My legs stopped working for a second, genuinely. My brain sent the signal and my legs said no. I knew what I was looking at before I consciously processed any of it. The skin, the color, and that same flat, even mannequin pallor. A body lying on its back in the brush with its arms at its side and its mouth wide open. I stood there for about 10 seconds, which is a long time to stand still in the field with your partner 20 yards away calling your name. Eventually, I heard him. Gillette was asking if I was okay. I told him I found something and that I needed a minute. He probably thought I was about to throw up, but I wasn't. My body was doing something else entirely, trying to be in 2 times at once. I was standing there in the October brush, staring at a body, and I was also sitting on a mossy log 4 years ago, in a gully, smelling nothing where there should have been something. This one was female, small build, dark hair, mid-20s maybe. No match to either of the missing campers. It had that same incorrect freshness, and the same untouched skin and absence of smell, and that disinterest from insects, even though I saw them everywhere else. The mouth was open, the jaw wide, but this time the teeth were all there, every one of them, clean and white and in place. The jaw wasn't wrenched or torn, but open, relaxed open, if that makes sense, sort of like someone falling asleep on a long car ride. Even so, it looked like the same thing. I could feel it in my bones. Whatever I'd found in that gully 4 years ago, here was another one, 12 miles north. I called it in. Gillette and I sat with it. He kept looking at me funny because I think my face was doing something I wasn't aware of. I asked him not to include that in his report, and he said, "Include what?" A good man. The ME's report came back 10 days later. I requested a copy, which I had to justify to my supervisor, a woman named Chloe, who was efficient and disinterested in anything that created extra paperwork. But I explained that I'd found a similar body years ago, and I wanted to compare notes. She gave me a look that lasted about 2 seconds too long, but then approved the request. Here are the notes. Cause of death undetermined. No trauma, no toxicology. Internal examination noted the same thing as the first. Reduced organ mass. The body was lighter than it should have been for its size, and this time the examiner added something new. Lacerations in the esophagus and upper trachea. Deep vertical scratches running from somewhere below where the stomach should have been, and up through the throat, like something with a rough surface had dragged itself through from the inside. The scratches were clean and dry. There was no blood or inflammation, no signs of healing. Whatever made them did it close to the time of death, or close to whatever we were calling death, since nothing about these bodies followed the rules of dying, or humanity for that matter. A thought came to mind when I finished reading the notes, that whatever had left the first body behind had gotten better at crawling out. The missing couple was never found. Their families called, and those calls followed the pattern I already knew from 4 years back. I had to sit in that office and listen to hope die again. I tried to connect the two cases officially. I wrote up a summary and kept it dry and factual, then submitted it to Chloe with a request, asking for it to be forwarded to the regional office for review. She read it in front of me and said, "These are two unidentified remains found 6 years apart in different locations. They have no apparent connection to each other or to any missing persons. What exactly do you want regional to do with this?" She wasn't being cruel. She was right. On paper, there was nothing to connect. I wanted to say that they're the same and they feel the same, that we're dealing with strange bodies that have nothing inside them and the same nothing around them, and that if you look closely that nothing about this makes sense. But you can't write that kind of stuff down in a federal report. This isn't some note in a survival horror game. So I just thanked her for the time and went back to my cabin, and I sat on the edge of my bed for a while. 3 months later in January, Philip, Richard, and I pulled a 2-night backcountry assignment, a trail survey after a series of late fall storms. We had to check for washouts, downed trees blocking access, structural damage to the footbridges on the upper loop. It was a long enough route that camping made more sense than trying to rush it in a day. I almost asked to swap off the assignment. I'd been sleeping badly since October, worse than my usual bad, and the thought of 2 nights out there put a knot in my chest, which I couldn't have explained to anyone without sounding like I was going mad. But I didn't swap, because Philip and Richard were both on the roster and I trusted these guys, and also because my dad would have done the survey without even thinking twice. Even then, I was still measuring myself against a dead man's calm. I packed my bag and went. The first day was good, actually. Cold and clear. One of those January days where the air feels like it's been cleaned. We hiked the lower section, flagging 2 washouts and a bridge with a cracked stringer. We ate trail mix and jerky, and we made camp at a designated site on a flat bench above the creek around 4. Richard brought an absurd amount of food. Summer sausage, a few different kinds of cheeses, crackers, bags of those little mandarin oranges. He laid it all out on a flat rock like a buffet. Philip said it looked like a charcuterie board for people who shop at gas stations. Richard took that as a compliment and said thank you, that he had worked hard on it. We got a fire going as the light dropped. The temperature was falling, but the sky was clear and there was no wind, which is rare up there in the winter. The smoke went straight up. We sat on logs around the ring and ate too much of Richard's food, talking about nothing important. Philip was trying to convince Richard to watch some Korean horror movie that he said was the best thing he'd seen in 5 years. Richard said he didn't like scary movies, because they made him feel bad for the characters. Philip said that was the point, but Richard said no. He meant he'd feel bad for days afterward, and it would just ruin his week. Knowing Richard, I believed him. Around 8, the conversation hit one of those comfortable lulls, where no one feels the need to fill it, and then Philip said, "You guys hear about Bud Gianelli?" Richard shook his head. I hadn't either. Philip poked at the fire with a stick and settled back. "He was here before either of you. Retired maybe a year before you started," he said, nodding towards me. A quiet guy, apparently. The old-timers said he almost never talked about himself. But there was this one thing he told a couple people, and it made the rounds. "Of course you know what it is, huh?" Richard said. "Of course I do." Philip snapped the stick in half and tossed the short end into the coals. So, Bud's doing a solo patrol in the upper North Fork. Late summer, maybe 05 or 06. Long day, nothing happening. He's heading back down and he comes around a switchback, and there's a guy on the trail about 50 feet ahead, just standing there. Bud calls out. The guy turns around and waits for him. "Okay," Richard said. They walk together for about a mile. Bud tries to make conversation. The guy answers, but barely, just short replies. He doesn't volunteer anything. Bud figures he's just tired. Maybe he's one of those hikers who doesn't want to chat. No big deal. So they're walking, and at some point Bud stops to fix his boot. The laces came loose or whatever. He looks down for maybe 15 seconds. Philip paused. He looks back up. The guy is gone. Richard waited. Gone where? That's the thing. The trail was straight for 100 yards in both directions. No side trails, steep hillside on one side and a drop-off on the other. There was nowhere to go. The guy was just gone. He could have ducked into the trees to piss, Richard said. On a steep hillside with no shoulder, in 15 seconds, without making a sound, without Bud hearing a single footstep. Philip shrugged. Sure, maybe. Richard looked into the fire. Okay then, that's weird. It gets weirder. Bud told a couple guys about it over beers. They asked him what the man looked like, and he couldn't say. He'd start to describe the face and just trail off, like the memory wouldn't stay in his hands. After a few weeks, he could barely remember the encounter at all, just that it happened and that it bothered him. What do you mean he couldn't remember? I mean the details wouldn't stick. He knew there was a man, he knew they walked together, but the specifics kept sliding away. The face, the clothes, the voice, all of it just sort of dissolved. Nobody said anything for a few seconds. The fire popped and sent a thread of sparks up into the dark. That's freaking creepy, Phil, Richard said. Philip grinned. I laughed, but I was thinking about the trail Bud had been on when it happened. Upper North Fork. The second body had been found about 2 miles from that section. I didn't say that. I sat with it and let the conversation move on. We turned in around 9:30. I was in my bag, Philip was in his tent, Richard was in his, and I was staring at the nylon ceiling trying to convince my brain to shut down, which is a negotiation I lose most nights. The creek was loud enough to cover the small sounds. It was peaceful. Otherwise, it was total silence out there. Without the creek, it would have been too unsettling for me to fall asleep. Out there at nights like this, you have to have something else to listen to. The downside was, though, that I could not hear what was moving around us. I don't know what time it was when I heard Richard's zipper. If I had to guess, I think it was around midnight. I heard him get out of his tent, footsteps on frozen ground, and I assumed he was going to take a piss. I almost went back to the half asleep I'd been managing. Then I heard him say something. Not to me, but outward, toward the tree line. It sounded casual and friendly, like someone had wandered into the camp.
Hey, you okay out there? You need some help?
I was out of my bag quick. I unzipped my tent and the cold hit me, and I saw Richard standing about 20 feet from the fire ring. He was facing the trees to the north. He was looking at someone. I could see the shape of a person standing just past where the ember light gave out. They were about 40 yards from camp in the trees, standing upright and still. I could tell they were facing us, but I could not see the face. I couldn't see much detail at all. I could see the outline, average height and average build. They stood like they were waiting for a bus. There was nothing overtly wrong with what we were looking at, and yet my whole body went cold anyway. Richard took a step toward the shape.
Hey, do you need some...
Richard. I said it too loud for the middle of the night, but I didn't care. He turned and looked at me, and I could see his face in the faint orange light. He looked confused, not scared. He hadn't felt that wrongness like I had yet. I said to him, "Come back to the fire, right now." He looked at me, then looked back at the figure. Something in my voice must have been enough, because he walked back to me without an argument, though he kept glancing over his shoulder. Philip was awake now too, sitting up in his tent with his headlamp on, asking what was happening. I told him there was someone at the edge of our camp. Philip put on his boots and grabbed his flashlight, then aimed it at the tree line. The moment the light hit, there was nothing there. The space where the figure had been was now empty, just trunks and branches in the dark.
What? I saw someone, Richard said,
though it sounded like he was trying to convince himself as much as us.
They were right there,
he pointed. Philip swept the light back and forth. Could have been a hiker, lost maybe.
They were just standing there, Richard said.
Well, did they say anything? Philip asked. Richard started to answer, then stopped. His mouth opened and closed, and his eyes went somewhere far away for a second. Then he said,
I think so, yeah. They said something, but I can't. It was hard to hear over the creek.
I didn't ask what the figure had said. I didn't want to know if Richard had heard what I'd heard from my tent just before I came out, because I had heard something too. Under Richard's voice, under the creek, there had been something else, low and flat, a voice trying to sound normal, but I could hear something underneath, so faint I could almost convince myself I'd imagined it. Something that buzzed, a deep rumbly vibration like a wasp trapped in a cello. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. It was the worst thing I'd ever heard.
Let's keep the fire up, I said. I'll take first watch.
They were both fine with that. Philip got the fire rebuilt. Richard sat close to it and kept his headlamp on, aiming at the trees for the next hour, even though the fire was bright enough to see by. I sat with my back to the flames, watching the dark. I was shaking instead of sleeping. At first light, we packed up. I said I wanted to head back early, skip the second night, and nobody questioned it. Philip was quiet in the hike out, but it was different than his usual quiet. Richard was the opposite. He wouldn't shut up the whole way. He talked about the food he'd brought, the bridge that needed repairs, about the Mariners' off-season moves. He reminded me of someone that wanted to fill the air with enough normal words that the abnormal might go away. A week later, I put in a request to be taken off overnight assignments for the rest of the season. My supervisor approved it. I think she assumed it was my anxiety, which, in a way, it was. 5 months later, in June, a day patrol ranger named Tate found a man sitting on a boulder near the Elk Creek trailhead, about 30 feet off the parking area. The man was sunburned and dehydrated. He had a cut on his forehead that had scabbed over badly, and he was sitting very still with his hands on his knees, staring at the gravel between his boots. Tate tried talking to him. The man looked up and told him, "I need to go home." Tate asked him his name and where he'd come from. The man answered both questions, but did not elaborate. He had been missing for 2 days, a solo hiker, backcountry permit, supposed to be on a 3-night loop through the upper draw. His car was in the parking lot, and his pack was gone. Tate called it in. The man was coherent enough that it wasn't a medical emergency, but he was clearly in rough shape. The man was hypothermic despite the June warmth and dehydrated, scratched up from off-trail travel. They brought him to the station and got him water and a blanket. Then they started the standard lost hiker debrief. Where did you leave the trail? When did you realize you were lost? Do you remember landmarks? He answered everything in short sentences. He'd left the trail at the Upper Fork Junction. He'd gotten turned around sometime the first afternoon and spent a night in the open. He found the creek the next morning and followed it down. A pretty typical lost story. The ranger doing the debrief wrote it up, and that would have been the end of it, except Tate mentioned it to Philip at shift change. It was an offhand comment. "We found a guy sitting by Elk Creek. Looked like he'd seen a ghost." Tate didn't mean it literally. It's just a saying after all. But Philip, you know how he has a nose for this stuff, he asked a couple of follow-up questions, and something about the answers made him come find me. "You should talk to this guy," Philip said. He was standing in the doorway of my cabin with his hands in his pockets and a look on his face I hadn't seen before. The lost hiker from Elk Creek. He told Tate something about meeting another hiker on the trail before he got lost. Tate didn't push him on it, because the guy was pretty shut down by then, but the way he said it. I don't know, man. I think you should go talk to him. Philip didn't say why he thought I specifically should be the one to do it. He didn't reference the camping trip or that figure in the trees. We never really talked about that night much anyway. And yet he came to me, and I think that tells you something about what Philip knew without knowing it. The man was still at the station at the time. He'd refused a ride to the hospital and was sitting in the break room drinking a Gatorade, staring at the microwave. I pulled up a chair across from him, and I told him I was a ranger and that I'd heard he'd had a rough couple of days. I said I just wanted to make sure we had the full picture. I asked if he could tell me what happened from the beginning. He didn't even look at me right away. He was tugging at the label on the Gatorade bottle, nervously. Eventually he said, I met someone on the trail. I waited. His story came out slowly. He was on the upper fork about 4 miles in, moving slowly because his pack was heavy and the trail grade was steep. He came around a bend, and there was a man on the trail ahead of him, about 60 feet out, walking the same direction. He said the man had an average height and build. He wore a green jacket and jeans and had a pack on. The man heard him coming and turned around, waiting for him to catch up. He gave a little wave, too. Our survivor here waved back. They fell into step together. The man seemed normal at first and friendly. He said hello, said something about the weather, the standard trail small talk. The survivor asked where he was heading. The man gave an answer. The survivor told me he couldn't remember what the answer was. They walked together for maybe a quarter mile. The survivor did most of the talking. He told me he was a talker on the trail, liked to have company, and the other guy seemed to like having company. After a few minutes, he started to notice things, though. The man had a flat, level voice. Every word came out around the same pitch and the same volume, like the worst actor reading off a card. The survivor figured maybe the guy was just tired, maybe shy or not a native speaker. Then he described something that made my heart skip a couple beats. He said that there was something underneath the man's voice, a low hum or vibration, like the sound you hear when you're near a power transformer, a deep electrical buzz you can feel in your back teeth. Except it was coming from the man's chest or throat. He only noticed it during pauses in conversation when the man was not speaking, and even then it was faint. He told himself he was imagining it. But then, the eyes. The survivor tried to make eye contact, but couldn't. The man would turn his face toward him when he talked. The orientation was right. The head was aimed at his. The face was aimed at him. But the eyes were off. They'd be pointed at a spot just to the left of the survivor's face, or just above his forehead. When the survivor shifted, leaned a little or turned his head, the man's eyes did not track. They would adjust, but always to a different, wrong spot. It was like they were approximating where to look without understanding the concept. I remember the way he described it, like trying to make eye contact with a painting, and I liked that, though it was extremely creepy. Probably why I remember it after all this time. Said everything's facing you, but nothing's looking at you. The survivor stopped on the trail and told the man he needed to check his map. The man stopped too. This was the part where the survivor put the Gatorade bottle down and his hands went flat on the table. The man just stood there. He didn't take off his pack and he didn't sit down. He didn't drink any water. He just stopped moving and stood there on the trail facing the survivor, arms at his sides. He could have been a mannequin in a store window like that, completely lacking shifting weight or fidgeting. People don't stand perfectly still like that. People are always doing something. This man had stopped, and the stopping was complete, like pausing a video, nothing like stopping mid-hike. The survivor said he stood there pretending to look at his map for about 30 seconds, and in that time, the man did not move once, did not blink, he did not breathe, or at least didn't see him breathing. But that buzz, it was still there, louder in that silence. He folded his map and put it back in his pocket. He told the man he had just realized he needed to double back because he had missed a junction. The man didn't respond right away, but soon he said, "Okay." Same flat tone. The survivor turned and started to walk back up the trail. He told me the worst part of the entire experience was the 15 seconds after he turned his back, because he didn't hear footsteps behind him. He didn't hear anything. He wanted so badly to run, but he kept his composure and walked briskly, without looking back. He left the trail at the first game path he found and pushed into the brush and kept going. That's when he got completely and hopelessly lost. He spent the night under a Douglas fir with no shelter and no fire. He barely slept. Twice during the night, he swears he heard someone call his name from the trees. Clear, calm, his first name, spoken in that level tone from before. He told me he had never given the man his name. He said he was sure about it, would swear his life on that fact. I talk too much on the trail. I know that. I told the man where I was from. I told him about my dog. I told him about the drive up. But I'm telling you, I never gave him my name. I know I didn't. Because right before I got off the trail, I was thinking, why did he never ask? Most people ask. I then asked if the other hiker followed him off the trail. He said he didn't think so. He never saw the man again after he turned his back. But both times his name was called, it came from a different direction. The first call was uphill to the east. The second was downhill to the west. Both calls sounded the same distance away. I didn't say anything after he finished. I was kind of turning it over in my head. He kept peeling at the Gatorade label again. He'd gotten most of it off by now, and was now working at the adhesive residue with his thumbnail, scraping it into little gray rolls on the table. I watched him do it, and I didn't trust myself to speak yet. I took a few deep breaths. Then I asked him one more question. I asked if the man's eyes had ever looked directly at him, even once, even for just a split second. He thought about his answer for a very long time before he gave it. But finally he said, No, I don't think he ever did. I drove home that night and sat at my kitchen table, pulling up both ME reports on my laptop. I read them carefully, side by side. The first body. The teeth were pushed out, jaw forced open, mostly empty inside. The second body, the jaw was open, teeth intact, throat scratched from the inside, also mostly empty inside. And now we had a living witness who had walked beside something that couldn't make eye contact, could not modulate its voice, which stood like nothing on earth stands when it wasn't moving. Forgive me, but I'm gonna tell you what I think is happening. I obviously don't have all the evidence for this. I have 2 bodies and a camping trip, and a delirious hiker who heard his own name called from the dark by something he had never given it to. In terms of evidence, that's all I have to go on. But anyway, what do I think? Well, I think something is out there in the deep back country, in the parts of the forest where the trails thin out and the canopy closes and you can walk for 8 hours without seeing another human soul. I think, whatever it is, it builds these things, these bodies. They're more like suits to it. I don't know what it builds them from, and I don't know how. I think it wears them and walks out there to where people are, and it tries its best to look like one of us. And I think it's been doing this for a long time. The first suit was crude. It climbed out and broke the teeth on its way through, leaving the jaw wrenched open, and it didn't care. But the second one was better, cleaner. The teeth stayed put. The exit was more controlled. The only sign that anything had passed through was the scratching inside the throat, and you would need an autopsy to find that. Because of all of this, I think about what the third one might look like. Whether there will be anything left to find at all, or whether it'll just stand up and walk to a trailhead, get in a car, and drive somewhere, sitting down at a kitchen table across from someone who has been waiting for it to come home. I'm reminded of that Bud Gianelli story, about him walking a mile beside a man whose face he couldn't remember a week later. I wonder if Bud noticed the eyes or the voice, and just filed it away as something the woods didn't owe him an explanation for. Maybe Bud was lucky. Or maybe he just wasn't what it was looking for that day. Frequently, I think about what Richard, Philip, and I saw in the tree line that night. There was no mistaking that there was someone out there. But was it really someone that needed help? Or was it something else? I'm terrified to think about what would have happened if none of us had woke up. Or if I had never stopped Richard from walking towards it. By morning, would there have been one more empty suit in the brush? One of our tents now permanently empty? Before I leave you, I want to say that if you hike alone in the backcountry, I'm not going to tell you to just stop doing it. People have been walking in these woods for thousands of years, and most people walk back out just fine. What I am trying to say is, if you meet someone else on the trail, and something feels very wrong, if the voice doesn't sit right with you, or the eyes never quite meet yours, trust that feeling. Those feelings exist in you for a reason. Being rude is much better than going missing forever. Turn around, walk away, and don't look back. Take that final message to heart. The next time you run into someone on a hiking trail or on the side of the road, and they act just a little weird, you might be dealing with something rather than someone. And that something might lead you into the woods to never be found. Good night. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Unexplained Encounters. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. Help us out by leaving a follow and review of Unexplained Encounters on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. You can even find more of my scary narrations on my other podcast, Tales from the Break Room, which is also on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. If you have a scary story of the unknown, send it to me at darkstories.org. Till next time, everyone, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.